Welcome. This is Linda Kopecki with the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition. This is the winter workshop. The first thing we do, and we've been doing this consistent, is land acknowledgement. So we, the leadership of the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition and the planning team for this workshop, we acknowledge we are all on traditional, ancestral, present day home of Indigenous communities. So these are the unceded lands of the Dakota Way, who have been here for thousands of years and whose babies have thrived on their parents' milk. The beautiful and life-giving legacy of breastfeeding has been broken in this community, particularly by violent acts of colonization and forced family separation. So the Minnesota Breastfeeding is honored and privileged and frankly humbled to work alongside the Indigenous Breastfeeding Coalition of Minnesota and many Indigenous and non-Indigenous lactation professionals and advocates to reclaim breastfeeding as food sovereignty and breast milk as the first medicine. We're going to move into the next segment. Here's the agenda, just to get your bearings. And you'll see that the first segment is before our main presentation, but Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition has committed to embedding storytelling into all of our workshops and our summits and our continuing education events, just to make sure that we're sharing authentic stories from the families that we work with and our community partners around the state. The first one will be introduced by Shashana Kraft, who is a new board member of the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition. Shashana, please unmute your microphone and please tell us a little bit about the story and then we can share it.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Shashana. Bujune no Kasikwe, Indigenous cause, Makwa and Dodam, Gawa Babiganika, Gandunjaba, Gakabi Kong, and Danongum. I just wanted to introduce my one of my peer breastfeeding mothers from my Indigenous breastfeeding support circle that I facilitate out of Minneapolis. Her name is Jasmine Funmaker, and she is a beautiful, smart, intelligent, first-time mother. And this story tells a little bit about how she navigates breastfeeding through her employer and how she navigates breastfeeding or providing for her child at daycare as well. And so here we go with Jasmine Funmaker. Miigwech.
Mangshakra has honey winga hingari na hunchaki karachwa unangshana neohawani eja hoadikshana. Hello everybody, my name is Jasmine Funmaker. My Indian name is She Who Hunts for Berries. I am an enrolled member of the Ho-Chunk Nation from Black River Falls, Wisconsin. I currently reside in St. Paul, Minnesota. I am a first-time mom to a 16-month-old son. His name is Jude P. Nagani, which stands for the start of something great. We have been breastfeeding since birth. I had a cesarean, so my colostrum wasn't as ready as it should have been. But we were able to produce before we left the hospital. DDP also had a tongue tie, which was caught the second or third day we were there. So that was caught before we got home. It left my nipples really dry and really cracked, sore, but thanks to my Indigenous breastfeeding counselor for tips and nipple shields, creams, all the support she gave me from the beginning of my pregnancy all the way to the end during my breastfeeding journey, and she still continues to support me. The Minneapolis Indigenous Breastfeeding Group started in August of 2019, and I had given birth a month later. I was really adamant on breastfeeding and just making it a priority because my mother had breastfed all 5 of her kids. My sisters, they both breastfed their kids. So it's just a tradition and a value that my family holds dear to their hearts. And it's just something that we do. And it's like, it's normal to us, it's just, yeah, it's just something that we do. So I am a peer leader of the Minneapolis Indigenous Breastfeeding Group. I have been active in the group since we first started, and all the support of the other moms and the other first-time moms that were first-time breastfeeding also has helped me, given me advice. I have also gotten donor milk from one of the moms groups. I had to, so GDP was born September 2019. We stayed home for the full 12 weeks. I went back to work in January of 2020. Dad was able to get his hours switched to nights, and I worked during the day. I didn't really prepare myself for having to pump all the time. So I never had like a full freezer stash full. It was always only like enough for the next day or that day of. I remember I would be pumping at like 4 in the morning, stressing, trying to just get out, as much as I could, and it would only be an ounce or two. And to me, I thought I wasn't producing enough, but now that I look back, and that was enough. My body was producing how much my baby needed. But when I went back to work, I was also stressing about work, stressing about being away from my baby for the first time. He was on a bottle, getting my breast milk. Sometimes him and dad would have to come in. I would have to feed him on my lunches, or they would take the milk that I had pumped that morning. I also remember forgetting pump parts at home and not knowing what to do. So I would call my Indigenous breastfeeding counselor, and she would bring me the parts that I needed, such as a valve, a membrane, just something very important that I would forget. So that's when I learned how to hand express, and that I would actually get more out of hand expressing, and it just felt more relief. I felt hand expressing. It was quicker for me, and I didn't feel so grounded to the pump. So I was at that job until July of 2019. JDP was already back at daycare. He went back to daycare. Well, he started daycare March of 2019. So when he was 6 months old, he started over there. And it was a transition for us. Again, I was having anxiety and stress about him not being with mom or dad, and he was taking the bottle well, which was good. I would have to, again, bring him milk on my lunch or feed him on my lunch. And he was just like a 5-minute drive away. So that made it easier for both of us. And then July of 2019, I had changed jobs, and I actually now work at JDP's Child Care Center. And they're so supportive of my breastfeeding. They let me go in his room and feed him, and just anything I need, they're there to help me pump and make sure we are both comfortable.
No,
For
probably
instance, on
5.
my old job, there was no pumping area. I had to go downstairs where I wasn't bothered and felt had privacy and at
No, it's been
so,
on and off
somebody walking in
the
on
last few
me,
days.
or it just, they weren't really supportive. And I always felt like pressure when I was coming back. Like I felt like I was gone too long, or just like, geez, she has to go pump again. And so that's why I'm really glad that I made a job change, because I feel so supported at my new job, and it's a dream come true being able to work where my son goes to school, goes to daycare, and being so close to him from having a little separation anxiety. I think I had it worse than he did. And yeah, it's been quite the journey, a lot of ups and downs, and we spent a lot of time here on this recliner, skin to skin. From my cesarean, I couldn't get up and move around. Dad was always at work, so it was just me and him all day, always skin to skin. And I wouldn't have it any other way. JP is now healthy. He's still getting breast milk. He feeds after school and before bed and at nighttime. And I tried to wean and it didn't work out. It was probably more on my end that it didn't work out, just because it was so easy and just so comforting that I didn't want to stop. And he obviously didn't want to stop either. So I plan to have more kids and breastfeed my next children and just keep this tradition of knowing that mother's milk is medicine, and just keep it going for our future generations and have them have a healthy start from birth. Thank you for listening.
First of all, thank you, Jasmine, for sharing your story. And I just want to say that this is why we're here. This is why we've all gathered here today. All 81 of us have gathered in this virtual room today because it's important to help families get started with breastfeeding and to overcome some of the mechanical obstacles and all the challenges that families may have with the mechanism of breastfeeding. But the environments are so critical to helping families reach their breastfeeding goals. This is life. It is not simply about making sure there's a transfer of milk, but making sure that the world around that family is supportive and set up to optimize them reaching every single goal that they have. So our first presenter is Jessica Lee from the Center for Work-Life Law at the University of California at Hastings College of Law. So Jessica and I first met a couple years ago in preparation for a summit at the Work-Life Law Center in partnership with the United States Breastfeeding Committee, all about lactation policy. It was in San Francisco. It was in person, and it feels like 100 years ago now. So Jessica and I have stayed in touch, talking about different aspects of policy, and she's been a really good advisor and a good partner on all sorts of policy issues. And you can read a little bit more about her right here on this page. But I wanted to add that so Jessica's advocacy focuses on empowering pregnant and breastfeeding students, working parents, and their advocates by providing legal, policy, and strategic tools that they can use to overcome and dismantle structural barriers. She provides know your rights resources and trainings and educates parents and change makers on the legal rights of caregivers in the workplace and educational opportunities. So it really bridges the workplace and schools. So Jessica seeks to prevent discrimination by working with institutions to draft and implement family responsive policies. So during Jessica's presentation, we'll have a few opportunities to take some polls, to be engaged, and a couple opportunities to put some comments in the chat section. But if everybody could turn off their video and turn off their camera, that'd be their microphone, that'd be great. I'll turn mine off too. And we'll just let Jessica present. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about breastfeeding and work and school. Thank you, Linda, for setting us up perfectly. It is all about the environment. And thank you, Shashana, for telling your story. You know, we all see the return to work can be a major hurdle for lactating parents, but those of you here who help those parents navigate this can help them overcome major hurdles. So today I'm going to give just an overview of breastfeeding needs outside the home, ideas on how to incorporate meeting those needs into your patient counseling, those of you who are care providers. I'm going to provide an overview of Minnesota law on workplace lactation breaks, breast or chest feeding in public, and lactation accommodations in schools. So this won't make you a lawyer, but I hope you'll walk away with tools and ideas for how you can support parents in your community. I assume everyone is seeing the slides. I think it works. All right, let's go. So workplace support needs and best practices. Here's a quote from Barbara. She's a nurse who I interviewed from our 2019 report on breastfeeding discrimination at work. Her story is all too common. She told me it just became too much. It affected my home life. It affected my baby. My milk supply dropped. I was spiraling downhill when she wasn't able to get the support she needed to keep pumping at work. And she ended up leaving her job. And that's unfortunately really common. So I'm sure you're largely familiar with what lactating parents need, but let's talk about how that translates to the workplace. So first, lactating workers need time to express breast milk. Of course, you all know the importance of regular expression, but what does that look like in a workday? Well, in a typical 8-hour shift, a parent may need to express milk on an average of 2 or 3 times. That time period will be based on their body, their child's needs and typical feeding schedule, and the hours they're away. For instance, I talk with a lot of workers who need to travel a long way from home or childcare to their job. So they might actually need to pump or express breast milk as soon as they arrive at work because they've already been separated from their infant for hours. To get this time off, some parents are able to simply stop working, but the majority have to ask permission or have to wait for coverage to be available. Next, lactating parents need a private and clean space to express milk or to breastfeed. This can be a locked office, a locked conference room. Ideally, it should be near their work area, have a comfortable place to sit, a table, an electrical outlet, be near a sink. All of those core ingredients to being able to be comfortable. And we know moms who are comfortable tend to be able to express milk faster or more milk. Finally, some workers will need other accommodations, for example, a new uniform or permission to remove their uniform while pumping. And believe it or not, this was actually a big issue for armed service members. A while back, they were told you can't take off your uniform even to pump. Another accommodation may mean working from home for a mom who has mastitis and needs to empty her breast so often, it just doesn't make sense for her to come into work and keep taking breaks throughout the day. But usually these other accommodations are rare. But for each of these needs, it's important to remember that the less agency and power a worker has, the more challenging it is to meet these needs. So for example, moms who are working for low pay in the retail and food service industries are very unlikely to have an office they can go in to pump. They might not even have a conference room. They also typically need a supervisor's permission before taking breaks and must account for their time very carefully. But when things do go right, when breastfeeding workers have access to both time and space, they are 2.3 times as likely to be breastfeeding exclusively at 6 months. And that's just the bare minimum. That's literally the time and the space. So even those most basic provisions make a big difference to working parents being able to meet their lactation goals. When it doesn't work, when you don't get those supports, there are immediate and long-term health consequences. The picture here is of Simone Teagle from New York, who is a mom I've worked with. She experienced recurrent mastitis, but she was told to keep working with no pumping break. When parents aren't able to get the workplace accommodations they need, it's common to experience painful engorgement, clogged ducts, mastitis, high stress. We already have that, many of us working moms, and a decrease in milk supply, which all really quickly snowballs into the baby being supplemented with formula and eventually weaning earlier than the family had wanted. And that early weaning is often met with its own host of health problems for baby and mom. So for those of you who are care providers, what are the best practices? Well, first one, be informed. You can check that on your list. You being here today, I think, is an important step in that direction. And it's so important. If your intention is to enable parents to meet their breastfeeding goals, like Linda said, it's not enough to understand the body. The environment plays a critical role. And that's especially important when you're centering equity into your practice. A mom who's privileged enough to have 6 months off work is facing a radically different time breastfeeding from one who has cobbled together 6 days of time off. So factoring in work considerations into your counseling of patients or clients will help you ask the right questions and design an approach that fits into the reality of their life. The next step is to talk about pumping early. Now, obviously, some of you aren't seeing families until after birth, or even for a while after birth, right? But for those of you who have contact with patients before the birth or before a postpartum crisis, I encourage you to talk about pumping early. We want to ask, explain to them, what does daily pumping look like? How can they prepare? Encourage planning for this before the baby is born. It's typical and in some of the most heartbreaking cases, that a mother arrives back at work thinking it's obvious that she will need a place to express breast milk. Sadly, for a lot of folks, it still isn't. And so mom who's already challenged with sleep deprivation, she has lots of nerves about leaving her baby. She's now engorged, leaking, and panicking. And on the other side, we see many employers use a disagreement about lactation accommodations on that first day back as an excuse to push the breastfeeding parent out of work. So in short, figuring this out on the first day back is a recipe for disaster, but it's one that can be easily avoided. And reminding your patient very simply that legal and other support exists can help prime them to learn their rights, or at least feel a little bit bolder about the plan that they're making. So this can even help prevent problems in the early weeks. We see a lot of moms that I've spoken with who are struggling because they're trying to pump a massive bank of milk in the days after birth, thinking they won't be able to pump on the job, which again, a snowball effect of engorgement, oversupply, not being able to manage the amount of pumping versus feeding. It really creates a whole host of problems that can be alleviated if folks know their rights early. And then I encourage folks to try to spot those workplace issues. Is your patient back at work and seeking help for reduced supply, recurrent mastitis or plugged ducts, engorgement? There may be a workplace factor here. So ask the follow-up questions and be specific. So for example, asking, do you pump regularly, is likely to get a very different answer from how often do you pump and for how long, or tell me what your daily pumping routine looks like. Perhaps you'll be able to spot a worker who keeps getting interrupted while pumping and is unable to fully express milk. Or maybe you'll learn that a worker is cramming a whole days of pumping into her lunch hour. And of course, we encourage you to not make assumptions, acknowledge that a lot of parents have a lot of shame and frustration that they're having to put the work needs before what they want to do for their health and their baby's health. It's really common to feel shamed and frustrated for parents who aren't able to do more, but really, really want to. And you may be able to help, of course, by suggesting pumping techniques to assist in quicker pumping, demonstrating massage, suggesting alternate pumping schedules that may match their workplace issues, or encouraging them to get help if they might have legal rights that are being violated. And the next big way you can make a difference is by writing an effective work note, but we're going to talk about that later. So let's get started on the the legal side of things, what are the legal rights for lactating workers in Minnesota? I think there is a poll here. See where you all are.
I somehow don't have access to the polls. So
Oh.
Harry, do you have access to the polls?
I'll launch it now.
Okay, thanks. Is it launched?
I see it.
We have about
Okay.
25% of folks voted so far.
Okay.
Okay, maybe we should close it.
Okay, I'll end the poll.
All right. The leading answer, break time is a private space for those at workplaces with more than 50 employees. And then we have a tie on the other choices. Well, surprise, the correct answer here is actually a very generous one, which is whatever the lactating parent needs within reason. I'll explain that. First, let's explain the baseline rights. So most of you probably know that there is a federal law which protects the right to break time and space for nursing parents at work. I'm not going to talk too much about that law. It does apply to all employers regardless of size, but it doesn't apply to all employees. And actually, in your state, you have two great laws. So I won't talk too much about the federal law, but I'm going to focus on what is unique to where you are. So the first one is this break time and space law here, 181.939 for any lawyers in the room. Now this law requires reasonable pumping breaks. We'll talk a little bit more about what reasonable means, but it means breaks that don't unduly disrupt the operations of the employer, which frankly is rare to see. And these breaks are unpaid. They're unpaid pumping breaks, except where an employee is still working. So for example, if somebody is still answering the phone, still responding to emails while pumping, using a hands-free pump, they should still be paid for that time. If they're using salaried flex time, they should still be paid. So most salaried workers don't have to track every minute of their day. They're just expected to get the job done. So they could still be paid if pumping while still accomplishing all of their duties. And then it would be unpaid except where somebody is entitled to paid break time. So if somebody did want to use sick or vacation time, or if they have a paid lunch break already that they use for pumping, that should be paid. Next, they're entitled to lactation space. So lactation space here under this law has to be private, near the work area. They need to have access to an electrical outlet, and the space needs to be a space other than a bathroom or a toilet stall. And I should say it's just a space. It doesn't have to be a dedicated room. We've seen pop-up tents before. We've seen all sorts of strange configurations, or creative, I should say, configurations that make it work. As long as they're meeting this test, it doesn't matter what the official name or look of the space is, but it does need to be private, close, and not a bathroom or toilet stall. So 90% of workers are going to have their needs met by that law, but there's actually another law, and it's the Minnesota Pregnant Worker Fairness Act. Now, it's not often talked about in the context, in the context of breastfeeding, which is part of why I wanted to bring it to your attention today. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on it because it is so different. So under the Minnesota Reasonable Accommodations Law for pregnancy, employers with more than 21 employees are expected to follow this law. There's no profession or industry-wide exemptions, and it covers all employees with health-related conditions, health conditions related to pregnancy or childbirth. And so that includes lactation. Now, the inclusion of lactation in that isn't spelled out in the law, so it's often overlooked. But actually, a year before the Minnesota law passed, a federal court finally decided that yes, lactation is pregnancy related. Go figure. Shocking, it took until 2013 to decide that, but now legally it's acknowledged that lactation is a pregnancy related condition. And courts nationwide have followed that. So now we know pregnancy related, when we read that in the law, that means lactation. I'll also note that, again, while not spelled out in the law, we read this to include trans and gender nonconforming people. So I wanted to make that clear that many of the laws that I'm going to discuss today mention moms, they mention women, but courts typically have found in this context that it just means a person who can be pregnant, regardless of how they identify. So this law protects all workers at a place with more than 21 employees, and it requires that they be provided with reasonable accommodations. So let's get into the fun part, which is figuring out what that means. Accommodations are changes to how, when, or where an employee works in order to allow the employee to keep working and meeting their health needs, their lactation needs. So reasonable accommodations do this without causing an undue hardship for the employer. So it's a change in the workplace that doesn't cause too much of a burden for the employer. And most lactation needs fit into that category. So here's some common accommodations. Here's a common change in the work environment. Storage. So this isn't mentioned specifically in the law, but one addition I'd like to add to your consideration for breastfeeding workers is storage. Breast milk should be kept cool after a certain amount of time. And I've heard from workers at grocery stores and other workplaces that they aren't permitted to bring in bags to work. So a very simple accommodation would be to allow the employee to bring in their pump in a bag and keep a cooler at work to keep their breast milk safe. Those are the most frequent types of accommodations. They're very small exceptions to the rule that are made to ensure that employees can keep doing their jobs while protecting their health and their child's health. I saw a question about the last slide before I forget. Are there any known court cases where a male or non-binary parent had the law interpreted to include them in these protections and uphold their workplace rights? There have been in other states, not in Minnesota. If this is relevant to you, I can send around an example if you happen to face this problem in your state. Common accommodations. Here's another one. Maybe this is a little bit less common depending on the worker, but you might need a change in your job. This might happen when it's too difficult to manage other accommodations in the job as is. You might need a shift in how it's carried out. So that might mean temporary transfer, sending you to a different position. So maybe you're not at the cashier's counter, but you're stocking instead because it's easier to get those breaks. It could mean temporary job restructuring, modified work schedules, anything that makes it easier for the parent to meet their lactation needs. And I should say that these are changes at the employee's request. So we don't ever want to boot an employee from their role, but if they see that there's another way to do things that is going to let them have their milk expression breaks or their breastfeeding breaks or whatever they need, that should be provided so long as it doesn't cause too much of a burden on the business. So say you're talking to someone, they want to know, how does this work? Well, let's focus on how you get there. First, an employee makes their limitation known. So saying, I need these breaks, or I can't wear that uniform. Sorry, I'm breastfeeding, it gets in the way. If reasonable, the employer has to provide it. But if it's trickier, the law requires the employer to engage in an interactive process to figure out the next best option. That process has to be timely, so it can't drag out for too long. That's especially important for lactation accommodations. It needs to happen fast. The conversation about accommodation options has to be in good faith. So everyone's there actually listening and trying to figure out something that works for the parent. And it has to be interactive, an interactive process. It's not just one email and it's done, but it's a conversation. So here's an example. The woman in this picture's name is Stephanie Hicks. She was a police officer in Alabama. It wasn't feasible for her to keep her normal duties out in the field and get pumping breaks. And she was unable to wear her bulletproof vest that's a part of her normal uniform. For her employer, the options were just she should go on patrol with no vest and no adequate pumping breaks, or she should stop working. That's it. That's all they offered. But there was another option. It turned out her employer allowed officers who couldn't go out on patrol to have a light duty desk assignment. So had they actually engaged in a good faith process, a good faith conversation, considered all of the options, they should have provided her with this other option. Instead, they were found by a federal court to have violated anti-discrimination law. So it needs to be that conversation. Every possible change that would allow the worker to meet their health needs needs to be on the table. But of course, the big question here is, what does a negotiation look like for a worker with low job security? We know that often there isn't a negotiation at all, and that's why it's so important for workers to know their rights and to have allies like healthcare providers who can help them so that this isn't so much of a David versus Goliath situation. What is an undue hardship? So you heard me mention that accommodations usually don't have to be provided if they cause an undue hardship because they're too difficult or expensive for the employer. Difficulty and expense are usually judged in relation to the cost of the accommodation compared with the resources of the employer. So sometimes we see undue hardships when it is a really tiny business. There's literally no space. There's only 2 workers. That can be challenging, but that's a very different conversation from a sort of environment where you have a large corporation that has hundreds or thousands of workers. So it all depends on how much that specific accommodation would cost and how much money the employer has. But I will say, in general, it's a pretty high bar for lactation accommodation exemptions. Most lactation accommodations are simple and cheap. It's a lock on the door, a pop-up tent, it's giving somebody a 20, 40-minute break. And one thing to note is that the fact that employers have to provide accommodations under other laws can be used as proof that it doesn't cause an undue hardship. So there's a federal law and another state law that requires pumping breaks. There's a pretty universal consensus that providing lactating parents with support is good for everybody. So the law is usually interpreted as a pretty high bar to claim that there's some sort of hardship there. The boss can't just say, it's too tough, I can't do it. They have to actually be able to prove that it's going to really cost them. So for those of you with a large screen, this is probably easier than others, but I've made this little chart with the top 3 laws that protect breastfeeding workers in Minnesota. So there's the law I just talked about, the Reasonable Accommodation Law. I refer to it as a PWFA, that's a Pregnant Worker Fairness Act. It's a category of law we see all across the country. There's the breastfeeding specific law, which provides that break time and space. And then there's the federal pumping break time for nursing mothers law, which amended the Fair Labor Standards Act. There's different levels of coverage for employers and employees. Thankfully, you have 3 really great laws to choose from here. The big difference is that the reasonable accommodation law only covers those who are employed by businesses with 21 or more employees. So all of this can be super overwhelming, but keep it handy as a reference. I think of these laws as puzzle pieces. So long as a person is eligible, and you look at the first 2 rows here for that, you can just pick and choose the most protective puzzle piece. So for example, we know under the Minnesota breastfeeding law that the lactation space has to be private. But what does that mean? Well, it hasn't been interpreted too much, but maybe you could look to the Fair Labor Standards Act, the federal break time for nursing mothers law, to figure out what that means. So if there's a debate about whether a mom's space is private enough, well, actually under federal law, they say that means protected from view and free from intrusion. So we know that standard. Or if a mom is covered by that law, but actually needs breastfeeding accommodations after her baby turns a year, she could look to the reasonable accommodation law because there's no limit. So pick and choose whatever is strongest can apply. And I think the big takeaway point here is that for any mom, any parent in any situation, there's very likely to be a legal protection of their right to changes at work to protect their lactation. So let's put some of this into practice. Here is a real world scenario. Vanessa is a housekeeper at a hotel. Her boss is okay with her taking breaks, but it takes too long to reach the lactation room. When she doesn't complete the assigned number of rooms, she doesn't clean enough rooms, she's penalized, but she can't clean those rooms and travel to the lactation space. So I'll talk you through what laws apply and what her options are. So looking back at this chart, you realize that lactation space needs to be near the workspace under the Minnesota breastfeeding law. So she's entitled to a lactation room that is nearby. But since this is a larger employer, she might also be entitled to any of these reasonable accommodations in this first column here. So she has a lot of options. She could demand a lactation space that's closer to her. To move a lactation space, she could ask for access to other spaces. Remember, under that reasonable accommodation rule, she can ask for any changes in the workplace that she needs. So if she feels safe doing so, she could, for example, ask for permission to use vacant rooms or any other room that she feels comfortable in. She could ask to change the rotation in which rooms are cleaned in order to get her closer to a room that's already been set up, and so on. So if I was talking with her, I'd have a conversation with her and ask, if the rules aren't in effect, or if you could make the rules, what would work for you? And I would also consider the rule about the number of rooms that need to be clean. You might want to give me a call for help here, but this is my general thinking. If she's paid per room, that's usually pretty set in stone. But if there's a quota, if she has to do a certain number each day, she could ask for permission to extend the day or to change the number that she's required to do each day. And that's usually reasonable, and because that's truly giving her a lactation break. That means not penalizing her for the time off. We actually had a similar situation with call center workers. They were allowed to take breaks, but their time away meant that they couldn't reach their daily targets. They were getting suspended, put on probation, all sorts of penalties. And using the federal law, we successfully argued that it's not really a break if the clock is still running on the amount of work that you have to do. So again, you might want to call a lawyer there, but in conversation with her, I would want to open the door to just letting her know that this might not be a situation she has to be stuck in, but there are many options and many laws that are backing her up here. Okay, I'm going to throw one more law into the mix. This one hopefully is pretty simple. Sex discrimination, treating a worker differently on the basis of sex. in a way that impacts their employment. That's sex discrimination. And treating a worker differently because of sex means because of pregnancy and related medical conditions or because of lactation. So if a worker is treated differently, less favorably because of lactation, that is a form of sex discrimination. So we have a poll here about this scenario. So Erica works at a small restaurant. She's never allowed to take lactation breaks when she needs them, even though other employees can take smoke breaks as often as they need to. Erica's boss tells her they're just too short-staffed to guarantee breaks. Well, the poll here is, does that sound like sex discrimination to you? Other folks can get smoke breaks. She can't get lactation breaks. Yes, absolutely. I agree. This sounds like an example of anti-discrimination. It's a small restaurant, so sometimes folks don't realize that they have to follow all of these laws, but usually they do, and we assume the anti-discrimination law applies. So why is this discrimination? Well, if other folks get breaks, she should get her breaks too. Also, under Minnesota breastfeeding law, she is entitled to those breaks. So a point I want to make here is that you're not just entitled to these breaks on paper. That actually means in reality, you're able to get that time that you need. So supervisors are responsible for making sure that their employees get the breaks they're entitled to under law. Now, if I was working with Erica, I'd probably give her materials to share with her employer about the right to actually take the breaks, talk to the employer about their responsibility to make sure that she gets what she needs. For a second, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on this. So have legal rights changed because of COVID? No. Essential workers are still protected. The reasonable test, the undue hardship test is still the same, but of course we know the world has changed around us. So it might have made the setting at some businesses so desperate that they are now a little bit closer to saying that there is a burden. And new time and space demands make it harder for a lot of employers to provide accommodations. And because we know undue burden is judged in light of their money, the amount of staff they have, and so on, all of that might have changed in the crisis. But the reasonable accommodation process is the same. It's still an interactive process designed to meet the needs of the worker and allow her to keep working. And those break time and space rules are still the same. Some common requests might be unreasonable in an absolute crisis setting, like an ICU, but there's always another law to look to, right? So, for example, an ICU nurse who's not able to take the break she needs could request transfer to a position where she is able to take the breaks that she needs. Not always guaranteed in every case. It depends on the specifics of her workplace. But I like to encourage folks to think of that plan B. Because you have a reasonable accommodation law, you do have access to that plan B. There are lots of safety options that workers are keeping in mind, which might be protected under that reasonable accommodation law. So that's accommodations to avoid exposure or protect from exposure, working from home as an accommodation, or any changes to the rules that they need to meet their needs. So those of you who are healthcare providers, we have some guidance about this specific to COVID, and the link is at the bottom of your screen. So Monique is a teacher. Her baby is just weeks old, but as an essential worker, she's being told to come back to work. Monique is worried about whether she'll be able to pump as often as she needs. She's also concerned about her health and the health of her newborn due to workplace exposure to COVID. Like I mentioned, reasonable accommodation law might give some wiggle room here. So I'd love to run this poll and see what you guys think. Might she be eligible to get some telework here because she is a lactating mom? Can we run the poll?
Carrie, do you have access to the poll?
Got it. Thank you. Yes. Yes, and maybe. I'll accept both of those as right answers. So for Monique, there are two big issues here. The first one is pumping as often as she needs. And the second one is exposure. So I'll talk about each of those. Usually in reality, you're actually going to look at both of those at once. So for a lot of teachers, then they need to disinfect more, right? They feel like they need to clean their pump parts. They might want some break in between when their lactation room has been used so that they're not going in right after another parent. They are taking every single precaution possible, and that might take more time. That's more time away from their students. So it's kind of a practical choice for workers in this sort of situation to keep teaching remotely. It's especially so because a lot of teachers have already proven that they can teach remotely. In some cases, the majority of the students are learning from home already. And so to continue that is not that heavy of a burden for a lot of folks. So, but as much time as she needs, as long as it's reasonable, that is protected by both Minnesota laws. But the potential work from home request is protected under reasonable accommodation laws. So if she is concerned about workplace exposure to COVID and her healthcare provider agrees, that would be the step that I would take for her. I'd encourage her to get a healthcare provider's note. A note from a healthcare provider to say that she's recommended to work from home is really useful tool for requesting that reasonable accommodation. In some cases, it's required to get a doctor's note. Or the healthcare provider could, and Monique could ask for basically a very strict protective protocol. So I've seen some parents say, all right, well, we need 15-minute breaks for the HEPA filter to run between every person who uses the room. We need full disinfection. No more than X number of people are in the room. It needs to be masked. It still needs to be close to where I work. I need that time for disinfecting. And basically, they're making such a long list that the employer often just says, okay, work from home. But it might just be essential that she work from home anyway, so that can be suggested in the note. Simply to work from home to protect her health. And so you submit that note, and it might need to be a negotiation. You might need to justify and really explain why this is truly in the employer's interest. But the law backs up both her need for breaks and the ability to get a reasonable accommodation that changes the entire way she works. So this is, I think, really exciting, especially for workers who are just immediately postpartum. She have babies who are very small. They might have ongoing health conditions of their own. Those pregnancy-related health conditions can entitle you to work from home if that's recommended by your healthcare provider. So please do use this as a tool in your arsenal for those parents who are very concerned about their exposure. So now I want to hear a little bit from you about what you're hearing from lactating workers. This is also a good time to submit questions before you forget them. I have a couple minutes of wiggle room here to answer maybe one or two, but please, any questions you have about the workplace, go ahead and take a second to enter those in, or share with me what you're hearing from lactating workers. I have a question here in the chat. Who would watch the students who are showing up in person if the teacher is remote? Is this just because of COVID, or do you think this is something that would expand beyond COVID? A lot of schools have put in place like floater teachers who are there in person. Some school systems have two different tracks for teachers who are remote teaching students who are also remote. I've seen school systems figure out quite a few scenarios that they use to deal with this, but the message that is most valuable to me is the fact that if this worker was actually at work, it's going to take her twice the amount of time to take these breaks. And so that means you're going to have two people in person to look after the students for a more significant period of time. So that has been useful in the teaching context. And then another question, is this just because of COVID, or do you think this is something that would expand beyond COVID? The law was not made for COVID. The law was made maybe 6 or 7 years ago for people who are pregnant and have pregnancy-related conditions to be able to get those reasonable accommodations. So if you are counseling patients who are pregnant and it is too challenging for them to be there in person, or you're concerned about their exposure to COVID, you can ask for telework as a reasonable accommodation. Now, it might not be reasonable in every circumstance. It really depends on the type of work and the type of resources the employer has, of course, but that is definitely an option for anyone with a pregnancy-related condition, including lactation, recovery from childbirth, any of it. And that would apply beyond COVID. So if somebody has a health condition and they need any accommodation at work, again, not related to COVID, it extends beyond that. Another question, what about a father who is a teacher? Would he have any of those rights? If a father has their own health condition, they might be entitled to accommodation under a disability law, but not under this law. This law is specifically for people with pregnancy and related conditions, so only to people who can get pregnant.
Okay, and Jessica, my question there was thinking that maybe it was related to COVID. So like curious about a partner who has a newborn, you know, or a pregnant wife at home worried about, you know, bringing
Right.
that into their
That is probably the most challenging issue that I deal with. So I run our COVID worker helpline, and we hear all the time from folks who want accommodations at work so that they don't expose their family members to COVID. There might be internal policies that they could use, but unfortunately the laws are only designed to protect the worker's health. It's not about the family's health. So I would encourage you at the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you the number for our helpline, and you can please share that with anybody who's having that sort of issue. We can talk through their rights. But in general, there aren't accommodation rights for folks to avoid exposure just to protect their family members, but there might be leave rights depending on the situation. So please get in touch with us about that. I have a lot more questions, but we need to keep moving. I will save these for the end. Thank you for sharing them, and we'll get back to it in our question section. Just want to make sure I get through a couple more aspects of this presentation. So public lactation rights. Let's shift gears and talk about your rights in public. Well, here's a scenario we just went over. Erica, she works in the small restaurant. Her boss tells her they're too short staffed to guarantee any breaks. So let's say she has used her breaks to breastfeed in the parking lot on her lunch break. A lot of workers want to do this. It's a fantastic idea, but her boss says you can't do that. What does she do? What rights does she have? Well, thankfully, there is a law that says a mother may breastfeed in any location, public or private, where the mother and child are otherwise authorized to be. So yes, the law addresses that too. Under this law, it doesn't matter whether the parent's body is covered. And the focus is really on the parent and child's permission to be present on the property. So that's usually not a problem at a parking lot or a restaurant, but maybe that's a problem at a factory, right? No baby rules make sense in some settings. But the key thing here is that the permission shouldn't be conditional on the way that baby's fed. So if babies are fine, but not breastfed babies, that's a problem. And I'll note that other work rules might still apply. So let's apply this to Erica's situation. She wants to breastfeed her baby on her lunch break. What are her rights? Well, yes, she can breastfeed in the parking lot. Under that law, you can't prohibit breastfeeding in a parking lot. Babies are allowed in the parking lot. Moms are allowed in the parking lot. So even if the boss doesn't want to give permission for that baby because that baby's being breastfed, I would say there's a greater rule in place here, right? But the employer could ask her to take off her uniform before breastfeeding. So, say she has her hat, she has her her shirt. That's the workplace uniform. Bosses do often say, don't be in your uniform eating, right? So they might be able to say, hide your uniform so that you don't look like you're doing it on the clock. Other work rules like that might still apply, and that might be reasonable. Similarly, a lot of workplaces do have rules that say you can't leave during your workday. So yeah, you can take your break, but it has to be on our property. You can't go outside, or you can't go in the parking lot. And if the employer did put in a type of rule like that, they could ask for it to be changed as a reasonable accommodation. So yes, I know you have a rule that we can't normally leave, but I need to pump in my car or I need to breastfeed in my car. That sounds like a pretty reasonable accommodation to me. Here's another similar situation, Jennifer. So when Jennifer's childcare had to close due to COVID, her professor told her that she could bring her baby to class. One day, Jennifer fed her baby in class, and after class, the professor said it was inappropriate and the baby is no longer welcome. So what are her rights? I will say this is based on an actual scenario. There are a lot of people out there who absolutely love babies, but as soon as breasts are involved, they shut it down. And to me, this sounds like a violation of the public breastfeeding law. The mom was authorized to be there. The baby was authorized to be there. The only difference is the fact that the parent is using their body to feed the baby. So that to me sounds like a pretty clear way of discriminating against breastfeeding parents. And it sounds like sex discrimination. So let's get into breastfeeding students' rights, talk about what this mom might be able to do beyond citing the public breastfeeding law. Really quickly, I see a question. Can employers or organizations deny access to the mom and breastfeeding baby now due to COVID? So example, the mom and baby would have been allowed in the establishment beforehand, but now they are being told they cannot enter because of COVID. There might be some buildings where that's not okay. For example, a public building, someone's a state worker, and the public uses that building every day. That might be problematic. We want to be really careful about laws like this or rules like that being used to target breastfeeding parents. But if it's an across the board rule that's already existed saying only these people can enter because of COVID, limiting access, I don't see that as being a violation of the public breastfeeding law, although it's definitely worth raising a challenge and saying, okay, I know you have this rule for COVID, but there's another public health need at risk here. Let's talk about how we can meet both needs. And I've seen a lot of folks find ways to do that. For example, setting up designated lactation spaces that are different than their usual lactation space, a place for that breastfeeding parent to go, requiring masks, all sorts of ways to limit the exposure. But I don't see that as a legal violation, unfortunately. Okay, student breastfeeding protections. So there is a law called Title IX. Who's covered under this law? Well, it's students, trainees, people in K-12 school, college, university, vocational school, any academic institution or government-funded training program. There is a rule against sex discrimination. Anyone that gets even $1 of federal support through, for example, student loan payments, any of it. So this is really broad. This includes folks in libraries and folks in prison education programs and so on. So if you're in an educational sort of setting, I encourage you to think about Title IX and sex discrimination. So where are they covered? So that's a student of any of those programs in a class, an externship, an internship, any training program sponsored or required by their educational institution. And what does it say? Well, Title IX prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex and pregnancy-related conditions. And as we know, when we think about pregnancy-related conditions, we think about lactation as well. So students' rights, first of all, time for expressing milk. Under Title IX, students are entitled to medically necessary absences, or including tardiness. And under Title IX, that has to be excused without penalty. So lactation isn't specifically mentioned in Title IX, but pregnancy-related conditions are, and there are these really fantastic rules making very, very clear that if an absence is medically necessary, they have to be given full credit, full opportunity to make up work, and can't be dinged for that time off. But I will say students might need to provide a doctor's note to access that. That's because they have that medically necessary requirement. But hopefully, either you have a school that is very happy to work with a lactating student, or one that knows that these conditions apply and don't require you to use a doctor's note, but you should be given that time as needed. The next step is a private and sanitary location. Now, again, the rules are so broad. They just say, don't discriminate. But the bottom line is that the school needs to provide a space that's functional so that a student isn't forced to sacrifice their education just because they're lactating. So a school would not dream of operating without girls' bathrooms. So why would they operate without a lactation room? And the final note here is that schools must protect students from harassment, intimidation, and discrimination. So that includes spaces that are safe, free from intrusion. You don't have all the other students coming in and out all the time. It also includes preventing or responding to disparaging comments about breastfeeding. So negative comments from teachers or professors, we know, can have a profound impact on the students' well-being and on their choosing to continue breastfeeding. So schools are responsible for making sure that that doesn't happen. And because this is a federal law, each school does have someone responsible for making sure it's followed. That's the Title IX coordinator. And I encourage folks to to reach out to the Title IX coordinators at the institutions they work with to make sure that they are considering lactation as a part of their duties. See, I have this question. Without policies, how will students or educators know about these rights? Where can they go for help? You know, at the end of the day, these laws are much more general than the workplace laws. So I really encourage folks to think about how to shore up these really kind of rough guidelines with a clear policy. And this might be somewhere where you submit a model policy to a Title IX coordinator and encourage them to think of how they can really flesh this out and make sure that students don't have to fight to get what they need. COVID-19 and students' rights. Well, here's the big one. Protections apply even in virtual settings. That should kind of go without saying, but unfortunately it doesn't. We've had students who I've worked with who've been told they cannot turn off their camera to breastfeed, they can't breastfeed their baby while in virtual class, or they can't miss class to breastfeed, even though they're there at home. But Title IX does not care whether you are attending your class in a big lecture hall or through a screen. You still have a right to not be discriminated against on the basis of your sex. And that means providing basic accommodations so that you don't have to sacrifice your education just to feed your baby. Let's talk through that scenario again. So when Jennifer's childcare had to close due to COVID, her professor told her that she could bring her baby to class. One day, Jennifer fed her baby in class. After class, the professor said it was inappropriate. The baby was no longer welcome. What are her rights? Well, first of all, there's that public breastfeeding law. I think I saw someone in the chat suggested bringing one of those laminated cards with you. I think that's a great idea. To help folks feel more comfortable being able to speak up when they're opposing folks in a position of power. Having that hard piece of paper, I think, is really valuable. I would also, if I were talking with Jennifer, encourage her to reach out to Title IX and explain that she feels discriminated against on the basis of her sex. She's being discriminated against because she's using her body to feed this baby. There was no problem with the baby until it was known that this is a breastfed baby. And so really, you can't differentiate what she's going through from some sort of sex discrimination. It is so clear that this is tied to her body, that she's being denied her ability to be in that class because of her body. So, but here's another question. At the end of the semester, Maria is worried about exams. The school has a policy that extensions to the exam time are only provided for disabilities. So what are her options? And I have a poll here. I'd like to see what you all think. All right, let's see what folks say. Yes, wonderful. That is exactly right. This covers exams as well. Just like in the workplace context, the rules can and should be changed for these exceptions related to breastfeeding. So the rule may be one thing, but I hope that breastfeeding students, like breastfeeding workers, will hopefully feel comfortable speaking up to see if those rules can be changed. As a general rule of thumb, if an accommodation can be provided to a student with a disability, it can be provided to a student with pregnancy-related conditions who has similar needs. So students with pregnancy-related conditions should be eligible for all the same support services as students with disabilities. But it's not advertised that way. Nobody, typically most disabled student programs don't mention pregnancy. They certainly don't mention breastfeeding. So it's going to be challenging for a student to know that she might be eligible for some of these supports unless somebody tells them. So please do tell them. And I will say the professors here likely need help too. About 80, maybe 90% of the time when I work with professors who have been dismissive of breastfeeding or who aren't providing lactation accommodations, it's not that they are terrible people. They truly just do not understand that the law provides extra layers of support for these students as a way to combat sex discrimination. They just don't get it, and they need someone to really break it down for them. There was a question here about students. Is a classroom truly a public space? Does the professor have the ability to govern who is able to be there? Breastfeeding is protected in public and private spaces. So even if it was not a public space, even if it's truly that professor's own kingdom, anywhere that the mother and baby are otherwise authorized to be, they can breastfeed. So if a professor has a no babies policy, we might be able to challenge it for other reasons. But let's say they have a no babies policy, then yeah, that's right. You can't bring your baby and breastfeed. It's not a pass into closed spaces. But if that space is otherwise open to you, absolutely, you can breastfeed there. And I have here and in the PDF a few notes that we do have tons of policy tools available to you all. If you are working with breastfeeding students, please do use them and call our helpline if you need us. So the last thing I'm going to cover before getting into some more questions are writing effective accommodation notes for breastfeeding. So I want to take you back, those of you who are care providers, take you back to what you can do to help. And one step you can take to make it all easier is writing an effective work note. Now, this is usually not needed for basic break time and space, but it might be if you have a really challenging employer that you're working with. And it can be useful for securing trickier accommodations or for getting students breaks, because remember, the law for students says medically necessary time off is excused. So you might have to prove that it's medically necessary to keep breastfeeding on schedule. So how a note can make a difference. Well, first of all, educating the decision maker. Like I mentioned with professors, they often have absolutely no idea what the law says or what the needs of a breastfeeding parent might be. So I've heard of many professors and employers who have said, why can't you just hold it? Or hey, we'll just pump 10 minutes and do 10 more later. They literally do not understand what needing a pumping break means. They don't understand how bad it hurts when you don't get it. So often that is one of the bigger barriers. And I encourage folks who are writing notes to talk about what those misconceptions might be and to address those in the note, because it's really challenging for a student or for an employee to go up to their boss and say, my breasts really hurt when I don't pump on time, or to explain the mechanics of pumping. But you could do that really well in a note. So educating the decision maker is the first step. Next, the reasonable accommodation laws and the student laws do require the advice of a healthcare provider. So that's how you meet the basic legal test. And even for folks just requesting the basics, having a note from a care provider helps them feel like they aren't alone. This is Stephanie again. Remember, she wanted a reasonable accommodation. She didn't get it. She said, having to choose to leave a career I love was one of the most difficult decisions of my life, but I had to do what I thought was best for my family. She left her job but it turns out she won a jury award for her lost wages and all the suffering they put her through. So without it, she might not have been entitled to any payment for the loss of her job. So these notes can truly be make or break. Not to put pressure on you all, again, I know you're not a lawyer, but while it may seem a little bit overwhelming to some folks to get involved, this is one way that you can make a massive amount of difference by just noting a few things. Before you write, I encourage you to really think about the employee and the employer's needs. So does the patient need time and space, or is it something more? Have they had breastfeeding complications? That's really important to note. It sort of amps up the level of urgency if somebody is facing potential complications. Are there special work conditions of concern? If you can get it specific to those work conditions, that's amazing. And then the question is, what seems to be the employer's barrier to providing what the patient needs? Is it that they just don't know there's a law? Is it that they don't understand breastfeeding? Maybe there's others who have similar conditions that have been accommodated. You want to ask as many questions as you have time for and try to write the note with those in mind. So educating the decision maker about breastfeeding and pumping, let's talk about what that actually looks like in the note. You would want to explain that breastfeeding and regular expression of milk is important, it's recommended, and make clear that this is important for the patient's health and that pumping accommodations are medically necessary. All of us here are very concerned about the babies. That's why a lot of us got into this work. But it's super important to center the patient here, center the parent. From both a legal standpoint and a persuasive standpoint. Unfortunately, the laws that protect lactating parents are focused on the parent's health, not on what the baby needs. So keep that in mind. Next, we want to be specific about the patient's needs. So you might want to say there's a need for a private space other than a bathroom. You might want to include the frequency and duration of breaks. So one great way to phrase this is to say breaks as needed, but at least X minutes of break time every certain number of hours. So that way, if the patient's needs change and they're not able to get a new note, you're not locking them into a specific pumping schedule, but you are setting a floor that they can't go under. You would also want to include mention of any unique accommodations if they're needed. So for example, avoiding COVID exposure, ability to get on desk duty, uniform modification, put those in there and be sure to list any medical conditions or impairment or history of complications that a patient has. That might give them an extra layer of protection, and it certainly gives them an extra layer of persuasion. Next step, we want to communicate that the patient's accommodation needs are temporary and that they're able to continue working or studying. Every now and then you see an employer who is just looking to push out a pregnant employee. They come with a note. The note says you have to provide this, and they think, haha, if I don't do this, they're going to have to leave. Well, we want to say, actually, they can keep working. All they need is this simple thing. And we want to remind folks that the accommodation is temporary. Sometimes employers kind of spiral and think, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to lose my conference room until the end of time. No, it's not. It's usually something that folks grow accustomed to over time, but we don't want to overwhelm them thinking that it's going to be forever, right? And then double check that you answer those basic W questions: why, when, where, and make sure you answer that how long. So those are just a few, just a little bit of an overview of what we encourage folks to include, but we do have a model work note available on our site. I should say that this is tailored to the workplace. It's actually on my to-do list to modify this for the classroom, but any of this would also apply to the classroom if you want to. And I should also note that those of you who provide care for pregnant patients as well, we have a similar note for pregnancy. So that's it. I know I've given you an encyclopedia of knowledge here, but I hope that this is going to be useful to you all. Please do look at your PDF of this presentation for a ton of links to where you can get more resources. You can contact me directly if you need to, and we also have tons of tools for employees, including COVID-specific tools. But for now, we can go through questions.
So this is Linda. Thank you so much, Jessica. I just have to tell you, I've received several private messages about how fabulous you are. So many thanks to you. Many thanks to the Center for Work-Life Law. We have about 8 minutes for questions, and my recommendation is that we stop sharing the screen, and then we each of the participants can show their video and unmute, just so we can actually talk about this sort of in person.
Beautiful. And I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'll just, again, remind folks that last slide has my contact info. I will put it in the chat as well. I am very fortunate that it's my day job to be able to help breastfeeding advocates help negotiate these accommodations. So please do reach out to me.
And one last reminder is that we keep a record of the chat. So if there's any questions lingering that we weren't able to answer, we can make sure that those are answered, and we can send that out to all the participants. But if anybody has a specific question that you see in the chat, or maybe they want to virtually raise their hand and ask it in person, go ahead.
I'll take a quick one. Can the teacher or manager request that a woman cover her breast while breastfeeding, or is that completely her choice? If she is in public, that is completely her choice. The law protects her right to be exposed in whatever way she wants. But if it's at work, that manager might want to protect themselves from sex harassment claims and all of that. And so it gets a little bit more complicated, but typically it is okay for them to ask for the worker to be covered. But if you're in that situation, call me. Should I just read them off? I don't see any hands. Okay. Can people from all states call you or the hotline for help? Yes, this applies to anyone from anywhere. Can you explain in more detail what you mean by temporary? I believe this is about the work notes. That's saying that this is literally temporary, right? So folks aren't going to breastfeed forever. I don't want to put an end time on it because folks have breastfeeding journey for years, but just literally noting that it's temporary and that the accommodation will not be needed in perpetuity. And then we should we tell employers that they will have to follow the law for X amount of time? The laws protect for an infinite amount of time. So the federal law has a 1-year cap. The Minnesota break time and space law says for the infant, so that's a little bit arguable. But the reasonable accommodation law does not have a time limit on it. So you could put an end date on it, or say we will revisit her breastfeeding needs at this time. And so like give her a year and then you'll check in and see if you need more time. If that employer is extra tricky, I think sometimes that's useful to just get them to get her what she needs immediately. But I would not put an end cap on it.
Hey, Jess, can I ask a question?
Hi, yes.
Hello. I this question came up a couple of times, but I'm curious, as I work for a county and I'm in the process of creating breastfeeding policies, what advice do you have for Minnesota employers who are creating pregnancy and breastfeeding policies? Do you have any?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first suggestion I have, which somehow gets missed, is to make sure there's a responsible party. Whatever you're putting in your policy, make sure that there is one point of contact that has the ability to negotiate on behalf of that worker if they're facing challenges with a supervisor or manager. Make sure there's a point of contact for the spaces, right? So say the workers are finding their spaces full. A lot of times employees try to figure it out on their own, or they mention it to their supervisor, and it's not getting up the chain that the workers aren't getting what they need. Have that person, that one person who you call up and say, look, this space is constantly full, we need a new one. And that person can navigate making new spaces. I think that's the number one thing that gets overlooked in a lot of policies, is having that responsible person. Beyond that, I would really try to merge these two laws. There's that break time and space law, which provides really clear guidance. The private space, electrical sockets, it needs to be near the workspace. I would try to flesh out the basics of what every space needs to have and the basics of what break time looks like, but give that wiggle room, that same sort of wiggle room that's in the reasonable accommodation law, by saying, if you have other needs, please get in touch with us. Leaving that door open means that those unique situations aren't going to fall through the cracks. But that's my 2-minute spiel. I could talk about this for about 2 hours. But if you want to workshop a policy, feel free to send it to me. I'll tell you all about it. I think the final thing, though, is that all the best policies aren't just policies, they're also training programs. They're making sure that when you onboard the policy, the important people are in the room, they've given feedback and buy-in, and you integrate it into your training and workplace culture so that it's not just getting dusty on a shelf. Do we have time for one more, Linda?
Yes, I would love to. The most recent comment is from
Yes.
David
Hi, Dave.
Schofold. And David, I don't know if you can turn on your camera, but I would love to introduce him to the group because he's an important part of this whole network of environmental support. He's with the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry. So David, can you turn your camera on and just
I don't have camera support right now, but I'll say hello. So great to be here with everybody and nice to meet everyone.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Not every state have folks at the Labor Standards Department who are this invested in breastfeeding. So yay.
Yeah, and we want to take your calls. We want to help with all the scenarios that are being discussed and enforce those worker rights. That everything that's going on, we want to be able to be there. And we do, when we take complaints, we need to investigate those complaints within 10 days. So it's a really expedited process in Minnesota.
And David, just so you know, this is Linda Kopecki, the ED of the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition, and I'm hoping to have a virtual cup of tea with you pretty soon, just so that we can see how MBC and the Department of Labor can be better partners.
Wonderful, great.
Is there time for another question?
Yeah, definitely, Barb.
This is Barb King. Jeannie Freebie had posted a question, and I'm very curious about a convenience store worker, the only employee, and is told that she cannot take time to be away to pump, and there's no one to cover for her. What would you say in cases like that?
Yeah, that's probably the trickiest scenario that we have because it is such a small business. So the laws still apply. You need to be provided with break time and space, but of course there's that reasonableness standard there. And so I think the question is, how unreasonable would it be to shut your doors for 15 minutes or 20 minutes? I've seen convenience store workers put up a sign and say, be back in 20. That might not be doable for every business, and it might not be doable for every shift. So one of the first things I think of is, okay, can she work the slowest shift? So if you know that there's like one person coming in each hour in the middle of the day, that would be the shift that I would request if I was that worker, and try to get there so that she's not actually losing much business by shutting the door. You can put a pop-up tent in the back. If she's able to, she could get a hands-free pump and pump while working. But I would say this is one of those rare situations where it might indeed be an undue hardship, the sort of situation where there's just one worker. But as you could see, like even just in 2 seconds here, I listed 5 different options, and I could probably list 5 more. Folks on this call could probably list 5 more if given the time. So even in those situations that seem impossible, I hope that you'd encourage reaching out for help, either to other folks in the coalition or to me, because together we can usually brainstorm some sort of creative solution. Might not get her exactly where she wants to be, but can keep her a lot closer to getting her needs met. Great. So I'm going to try to answer some of these questions in the chat.
We have about maybe 3 minutes.
Or should I send to, oh, there's more? Oh, great.
Just like, yeah, 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay. I was going to type. Wonderful. 2 new messages. Oh, just thank yous.
Maybe pick one message. And what I'd like to do before the breakout session is we have a couple more little video stories to show today. And I'd like to do one before the next breakout session. It's just 3 minutes. So Jessica, I want to maybe respond to one more question.
Yeah, so I've heard
and then we'll move into breakout sessions.
Instances of employers telling employees working remotely due to COVID that if they're feeding their baby at home during the workday, they would not be able to count that as work time, even if working while feeding. I told them the same support laws apply as if they were working at the office, and they would not need to share if they were direct feeding or pumping, as that is private health information. They should use the same time reporting structure as if working. It would be considered work time, even if feeding. As long as she is professional and her work outcomes and total working are good, no collective bargaining units. Was my interpretation accurate? I was ashamed of the supervisor's spirit and telling her this as she was scared and very confused. Absolutely, I definitely agree with you. If you are working while you are expressing breast milk, breastfeeding, it doesn't matter. As long as you're still working, you should be paid for that work. And you should be using the same time reporting structure as everybody else. So if somebody's employer is holding them to a different standard because they're a breastfeeding parent, that's a form of sex discrimination. And I want to call it that, right? And I want to act accordingly. This worker should not be under any more scrutiny than any other worker about how they're using their time, even working remotely. So yes, that sounds like good advice. And if things escalate, please do call us.
Okay, so thank you. Just want to say to our gathered community, please consider Jessica Lee and the Center for Work-Life Law a resource, because they're available and very responsive and very knowledgeable about those topics. So thank you so much, Jessica. We all appreciate you, and we appreciate the center.
And I appreciate you back. Thanks for what you're doing for breastfeeding families.
Surely. I'm just going to move into another video really quickly. What I would like to do though is if people could, again, turn off your cameras and turn off your mics. We're going to go back to sharing mode. And this is a video from Carrie Boyum, who is down in Olmsted County. And if you don't know that part of Minnesota, that's where Rochester is in Mayo Clinic, and she works for the health department there. in the, she'll just tell you a little bit about what she's been doing.
Hi everyone, this is Carrie Boyum from the Olmsted Area Breastfeeding Coalition on behalf of Olmsted County, sharing a little bit of an update from our seed grant project. So last year in early 2020, we were talking about local businesses that we could possibly help in the area, kind of spruce up their lactation spaces, do some outreach, see if they needed assistance updating their policies and advocating for breastfeeding women. The seed grant project rolled out, and the Olmsted Area Breastfeeding Coalition applied for it and received money for it, which is really exciting. So one of the businesses that we pinpointed in Rochester was the Rochester Technical College. It's a community college very close to the public health campus in Rochester. So reached out to a contact in the health services department, and they were like, yeah, let's do it, but kind of unsure how their 2 lactation spaces could be improved or what possibly needed. They just were really unsure. So asked if I could go and take a look, and they were more than willing. With COVID, it was a little bit different. I went in September on my own. There's a chair, but pretty bland, not very warm and welcoming, pretty kind of cold and obsolete. So shared those photos. And then with COVID, a lot of the nurses and WIC staff are being pulled to help with the COVID response. So one of the concrete things that we could offer the RCTC campus was that they could receive a hospital grade breastfeeding pump if they wished. So kind of collaborated with our state health-wide improvement project coordinator and married them up with RCTC, explained the process of achieving the pump, reimbursement process. They were very interested, just had some hesitancy about the maintenance of the equipment and who would be doing the cleaning, and explained that, wipes would be desired to be in the room and have women clean them before and after use, different things like that. So they're in the process of applying for the mini grant to purchase the pump and then receive SHIP reimbursement funds for that pump. And then an ongoing project is sharing ideas such as, getting new furniture in there, but possibly getting a small refrigerator, getting some art on the walls, some warm lighting, lamps, mirror, different things like that for moms that can use the spaces, and staff as well. So just an update on behalf of the Olmsted Area Breastfeeding Coalition for Olmsted County Public Health. And we also partner with Mayo Clinic, Olmsted Medical Center, and different areas in our area of Olmsted. So thank you very much.
So excellent. Thank you, Carrie from Olmsted County, for sharing. We're going to be moving into our first breakout room discussion. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the main session. I just want to remind you, now that you're back in the main session, in a few minutes, we're going to go into a break, a 10-minute break for everybody. But before we do that, would you please turn off your microphone and your camera. That helps with us recording the workshop. But please have one person from your session, your breakout session, write a summary in the chat. Please write a summary in the chat about what you've discussed. And then if somebody, maybe Pa or maybe Carrie, wants to look through the chat and read a couple of those, maybe 2 or 3 of those. Are there any summaries in the chat yet? Welcome back. I think everybody's back now. Just once again, please put a little summary of your discussion. So 1 summary per room in the chat section. We're going to keep the chat record, and we'll be able to send that back out to folks, or be able to use that to answer some other questions and send that to everybody after today. But if Carrie or Pa wants to look through the chat and see if there are some summaries that you want to discuss, you want to mention.
Hi, this is Pa. Sorry, I was busy typing up for the group that I was in, but now I'm
multitasking.
available. So one group says that challenges of a meeting for all community needs would be language, culture, historical trauma. We talked about bridging the clinical, hospital, and community lactation needs. Another group says, challenges include finding the party who is accountable for the breastfeeding policy, and obviously the dedicated space for lactation. And then opportunities is partnerships with SHIP and other community organizations. The group from out of state says that they discussed how to support undocumented moms who may be fearful to speak up to employers about their rights. They discuss how to encourage these moms to speak about this before giving birth and making sure that employers know their federal laws around breastfeeding. Another group says, let's see here. Challenges is switching from in-person to virtual platforms. Employer outreach is limited due to COVID challenges that employers are dealing with. So, we talked a little bit about that as well, is, when do you find the right timing to talk about breastfeeding, because everything has shifted gears to COVID response and how to operate under this pandemic. Opportunities include virtual platforms that have offered a broader reach. Partners could include chambers, WIC, local public health, and hospitals. A model program is breastfeeding friendly health department, work sites, childcare, and baby cafe. Now I'll do one more here. One other group discussed challenges of micro businesses, the role of Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, the importance of support from the top. So when an innovative policies start at the bottom, it usually gets stalled at the top. So having maybe a top upper management involvement at the beginning would help. And the important role of sending lactation mothers home with information and tools to be successful.
Great. Thank you. We're moving into a break now, so I'm going to pause the recording.
Hello, my name is Pa Shasky, and I'm a health educator for St. Paul Ramsey County Public Health. I work on various grants to decrease and prevent chronic diseases. Also, I was a recipient of the Emerging Leader Award for the 2020 National Breastfeeding Conference and Convening. Today, I am going to share with you my story of helping workplaces support breastfeeding. I work mainly on the statewide Health Improvement Partnership Grant. At St. Paul Ramsey County Public Health, I was able to partner with the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce to offer microgrants for businesses located in Ramsey County. The applicants did not have to be a member of the chamber, and the funding ranged from $200 to $800. The grantees had roughly 7 months to complete their projects, and within the 4 years of offering these microgrants, we awarded a total of 107 organizations. 37 of those created or updated a lactation space within their workplaces. Our grantees came from multiple industries, which included nonprofits, for-profits, public sector, firms, manufacturing, and healthcare. The sizes of their workplaces ranged from 2 staff to over 100 staff. The Minnesota Department of Education was a grantee in 2017. This government agency had a room that was not properly set up for multiple users. They used the grant to purchase signage for outside the room, a proper door lock, wall decor to make it more welcoming, and curtains to make this more functional. They also added hooks so that staff using the room did not have to lug their pumping supplies back and forth across the large building that they were located in. At the time, this workplace had 3 staff using the room and 2 more who were going on maternity leave within the next 6 months. Pentair Filtration Solutions is a manufacturing company and was a grantee in 2019. Right after their safety committee created a wellness subcommittee, this workplace applied for a microgrant. The new room has 2 armchairs, end tables, a mini fridge, cubbies, an electric fan, ottoman, and lamp. They were also able to frost the large window at the end of the room for more privacy. If other funds become available, they intend to install a curtain on the ceiling to divide the room into 2 and double the availability. After 4 years of administering these microgrants and helping various organizations support breastfeeding, here are some themes of challenges that grantees have shared with me. If the manager and supervisor was not part of the wellness committee already, it was hard to get buy-in. The public sector organizations had the most obstacles, as their organizational structure makes it more complicated to accept and spend outside money. An example of this is the St. Paul Police Department. They had to wait for the City Council to approve their spending requests before they could proceed with their wellness project. Staff turnover, especially when they are the project lead. This confirms that having a second staff member on the project or a wellness committee behind the project was crucial. Every year, mental health is mentioned and how it can be challenging to implement wellness initiatives if the work culture did not support it. And then last but not least, how to maintain momentum after completing the wellness project. Once the funding is gone, how do you continue to promote and support breastfeeding if there currently isn't a staff using the nursing room? Now, I'm sure that many of you have similar challenges in your workplaces. The most successful workplaces have these 4 factors. Number 1, a nursing room, obviously. Number 2, a wellness committee of 3 or more staff. Number 3, management support. And number 4, a breastfeeding policy that is regularly updated. This is how you will be able to start shifting the wellness culture in your workplace to become more breastfeeding friendly. I hope that you have enjoyed my story and that you were able to find some useful tips on here as you make your workplace more breastfeeding friendly. Thank you.
So I just want to remind you that we've been trying to have more personal stories embedded in our workshops. This was part of the Equity and Access team of the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition's recommendations for the coalition as a whole to have more storytelling. And it just speaks to what personal experience can do. A lot of times we talk about breastfeeding as far as statistics and mechanics, but really it's storytelling and it's culture and history and experience that makes us understand it so much better. I want to move into our next section, and this is learning from, we talked about model practices. Well, there's a wonderful model practice emerging in the Fond du Lac Reservation in Northeast Minnesota. And I wanted to invite Jamie and Samantha and Laura to share the Fond du Lac story.
Thanks, Linda. Okay, I'm going to get my screen share going here. Oh boy. Okay. A Java thing popped up. I'm not sure why, so it's good. It's fine. All right. So my name's Jamie Adams, and I work with the Fond du Lac Band in their planning division. And one of the things that we do there is a lot of grant writing and program development. We work with all aspects of tribal government, but do a lot around law enforcement, transportation, food sovereignty, utility development, and through our food sovereignty efforts is really how we've been connecting with our clinic and what led to this project. So we have 2 other members of our project team. Well, actually, Pam was part of our project team too. But I'll have Samantha Martin and Laura just give quick introductions, and then we'll start the presentation.
I'm not sure if my camera's on or not. I can't see myself, Jamie.
You're good, Laura.
I'm good. Okay. So my name is Laura Garza. I'm a public health nurse and the WIC coordinator here at Fond du Lac Reservation. I've been here for about 20 years, and I enjoy working with the population that comes to help, seek services, and I learn a lot from them. This was an awesome opportunity when Jamie came to me wanting, she had some extra money that she had found in a grant, and or I can't even remember right now off the top of my head, but yeah, I'm Laura from WIC at Fond du Lac.
I can go next. I apologize for not having a camera, but my name is Samantha Martin. I'm the tribal ship coordinator for Fond du Lac, and kind of like Laura and Jamie said, this was a really exciting project that we had so many different kind of departments and people working on it, because it really made it a lot easier to get this passed. I know that Fond du Lac had a policy in the works like for many years before this, and it just never really went anywhere. So we're just thankful that we were able to get this passed and implemented.
All right, so I just lost my pointer here. There we go. Okay. So the project really to create Fond du Lac's lactation policy, it started with some grant funding. And I've talked to some other folks about policy work, and they're like, how do you get it done? And it's like something that shouldn't have to take the grant funding to do. It's something that should kind of just be done, especially around breastfeeding. But the fact of the matter is, having some extra funding to be able to work on this type of thing is helpful. So we were contacted by Born to Thrive and Hunger Solutions, and they had the grant funding that was supposed to help nutrition for kind of that birth to 4-year-old range. And we had been working on a lot of food sovereignty efforts, and we've gotten funding from other places for like gardening support and that actual growing of food and distributing it that way. So we reached out to some of our human services division staff and kind of asked the question, like, could you guys use this funding? Do you have any ideas? And one of the things that had come up in our conversation was supporting our WIC program and supporting breastfeeding and our mothers, and how that's really our first foods and what that can do for the community. So that it was kind of perfect. We were like, great, like we have our project team and we have something that we can roll with. And as Sam had mentioned, Human Services had something already in the works. So our project team was made up of our WIC program coordinator, Laura, others in our community health, some of the managers, and our SHIP program coordinator, Sam, who's on here, and then me from our planning division. And we had an AmeriCorps Vista member who was able to put some time towards this. We brought in Pam to work as our lactation consultant, and then kind of worked with our legal and our human resources team to review and get things going. I should note that being a tribal government, pulling all these people together for collaboration was probably a little bit easier in the sense that we were already used to working together and kind of under that same umbrella. So easy to reach out and ask people to help. So the process that we took, the Human Services Division had a plan that was already started. So we didn't have to start completely from zero. We had something that we could work off of. And our AmeriCorps member was able to help kind of take that plan and update it to based on what our needs are. And so we wanted to really make sure that we captured what people needed and captured kind of a baseline of where we were at. So one of the things that we did is we sent a survey out to our divisions, our division directors, to do an inventory of what resources we already had. So we checked in with all of our different building locations to find out if they had a designated space, if their space had, you know, access to water, if they could be locked and secured, if they had chairs, or, you know, kind of just an inventory. Refrigerators, what do you guys have? And then what do you need? So after we got that, we were able to kind of put a list together, and with some of that grant funding, we were able to help get rooms set up for people. But the communication part was a key of getting this process going. So we set up regular meetings with our division directors. At Fond du Lac, our division directors meet once a month. Now, if you are working with a different tribal community, they're all going to be set up differently, but at Fond du Lac, ours meet once a month. So we requested to get on the agenda and talk about the policy, talk about the grant, talk about the inventory that we were doing, and talk about the policy that we were creating. And, you know, one of the things that was really important for that was making sure that we had buy-in and that people felt like they had a say in the policy, and it wasn't just a policy that was created and then pushed in front of them saying, now you need to follow this. We really wanted to make sure that people were invested and that it wasn't something that was like taken by surprise, so that people were ready to be supportive. I talk about the grant funding, and, you know, one of the reasons why I feel like we were able to have success is through that grant funding. We worked with Pam Galley, and she came in and offered trainings for all of the kind of manager level employees. So we held 3 different trainings, one at our Human Services Division, one for our casino staff, and one for our tribal center staff. And that training just kind of walked through kind of the proposed policy, still not final policy yet, walked through the proposed policy, did some education on why, you know, why breastfeeding is beneficial, what kind of time limits or time commitments people need, and digging into the details and providing a space that people could ask questions. So it was really interesting through those trainings because we had, you know, managers who were males who didn't have much experience. Maybe they didn't have a partner who had breastfed, or it had been many years, or even some of our female managers, you know, they didn't breastfeed themselves, and it had been a long time. So we had a lot of questions on, like, how long does it actually take? Like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that people could get clogged milk ducts and it could cause all kinds of problems. And it was just a really good open opportunity to have those conversations. So that was another part of the input process. So the conversations that were had at those meetings, at those trainings, were then taken into consideration when we kind of did the final version of the policy. And as I had mentioned before, we were able to purchase some supplies for the rooms that that needed supplies and help set up new rooms. So then getting into our approval process, we drafted our policy, we had the trainings, we redrafted the policy, and then when it was time for our final review, it went to our legal department and to our human resources department. Once we got approval from those two departments, it could go to tribal council for official adoption. And I can't remember if that was done by a resolution or by a memo to proceed. So after that was adopted, the policy went into the employee handbook. Then we worked with our human resources and employee benefits staff to kind of walk them through the policy, answer questions that they had, and then help provide resources that would be helpful. So when a mother or expecting mom goes on maternity leave or puts in for their maternity leave, they are given resources of here's what to expect when you come back from work, and just to know before they even go on leave that they are going to be supported when they come back. Okay, so what's in our policy? We wrote into our policy the ability to bring an infant to work up to 6 months or until the infant was mobile. And our policy got kind of implemented and approved right at the beginning of 2020. So just remember that this was before COVID. I know that we were talking about some of the laws around rights. To my knowledge, I don't know that anyone had been bringing in their infant during COVID, but I do know that some people were taking advantage of it before COVID hit. Also in our policy are additional break times or longer break times, the furniture and equipment requirement of each space, and then also the requirement that any new building that is built within the Fond du Lac, tribal government buildings, I guess, that are built would have a lactation space included. And I would just add, one of the challenges in our group discussion that we had that came up was that champion, or you might have a lull in mothers who are breastfeeding, and then sometimes it gets a little bit forgotten on the space or what needs to be done or what is, what the employee right is. And we were building a new building ourselves. I was part of the project, and one of the things that we forgot was the lactation space. And luckily, there were other people on the team who gave the reminder of, don't forget we have a policy and this needs to be in. So we were able to get that space. And it's a commercial kitchen to help support our food sovereignty. And there's also a lactation space designated in that building as well. And another story that I would share about our policy process is our casino had a space. You'll hear a testimony from our Fond du Lac casino, but this is of our Black Bear casino. They had a space set aside, but because it wasn't being used on a regular basis, it was turned into a storage closet and was not usable. When we went to go do our audit, it was thought that the space was still there. And so to find out that the space wasn't there anymore, I think that was kind of like an extra driver of this is why we need to have a policy to protect those spaces so that they don't get turned into something else if they're not being used on a regular basis, because you never know how often you're going to have breastfeeding mothers and when people are going to use the space. But I think that was helpful for us as far as like our driving factor, because it really got people on board. Like, we need to protect these spaces and make sure that they're available.
Greetings. My name is Tammy Dixon. I'm a member of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. I am currently employed by the tribe both at Fond du Lac Casino, downtown Duluth, as a floor manager and as a doula. When I was growing up during the 1970s, I wasn't around anyone who breastfed their babies. It wasn't until my sister-in-law gave birth to her daughter that I ever saw anyone breastfeed. I was shocked and fascinated with the process and delighted by the idea that the milk was perfectly designed by her body for her baby. So in 2005, at 40 years old, I decided I was going to breastfeed my baby too. During this time, I found out that every lady who was lactating at Fond du Lac was using empty offices in the evening, and mostly ladies were forced to use the busy locker room. It was sometimes dirty and had no privacy at all. As a new mother and a manager, I decided to ask the casino manager, Morris Ojibwe, for help finding a lactation room, allowing our lactating staff a clean, private space where they could stay on their schedules while they're away from home, away from their babies. So Morris immediately agreed and designated an empty room in the basement. He purchased a little refrigerator and located a cabinet to store pumping supplies. After a while, our room was allotted for office space, and we were forced to find other accommodations. We were moved to a new spot just off the casino floor in an old bar setup. It was converted into our lactation room, and it was fabulous. It had running water, and it was quick for our staff to get off the floor, pump, have their break, and get back on. Unfortunately, it was again needed, and we were forced to find other accommodations. Thankfully, the casino had just remodeled, and a small room was found in the basement. And it was connected to our storage of our uniforms, but it was a private, quiet space for our lactating moms to use. It was very cozy and has been furnished with grant monies that Fond du Lac had obtained. We now have a nice little rocking chair, a table with a lamp, and a new mini refrigerator, and have beautiful wick posters with tribal members on it. I haven't had anybody been able to use it due to reduced staff, and no one had been pregnant recently. But our human resource staff let new employees know that it is available if they have a baby and choose to use it. I encourage any of our male staff with pregnant partners or wives to give all the positive support, and if they have any questions, I am always available for them or their wives, staff at any time. I'm proud that Fond du Lac has been able to utilize the space in the basement for all of our lactating moms, and am extremely excited that Fond du Lac has created a policy for breastfeeding.
Bonjour, my name is Sophie Tibbetts. I am from Nagachimanung, Fond du Lac. I recently gave birth to my baby boy in June of 2020. I have an older son. He was breastfed till he was about 16 months old. So when I got pregnant with my second son, I knew that's what I was going to try to do too. I didn't really necessarily choose to breastfeed, I don't think. I just knew that's what was going to happen. I didn't ever consider the option of formula feeding. I knew it was there if I absolutely had to do it, but it was never a real thing for me, which I'm really thankful for, because I know some women really struggle with breastfeeding, and that has never been the case for me. Breastfeeding is important because it keeps my baby alive, it keeps him healthy. It also helps me have a special bond, I think, with him, and it helped with his brother, and it's something I'm really grateful and thankful to be able to do. The space at my work really helped me to continue breastfeeding, because they have a really nice lactation room now, and it's super comfortable, and it's set up really nice. It has everything that I need in there, and it has been working great. Knowing that that room was there for when I came back to work was really helpful too, because I knew that there would be a space for me to use to pump. I was nervous to come back to work just because no one really is 100% ready to come back to work after having a baby. But because of this pandemic, I have been able to work half from home and half in the office. So working from home and working in the office has made this breastfeeding journey this time around a little bit easier, because while I'm working from home, I'm able to be with my baby and breastfeed him while I'm here. And when I'm in the office, I just go use the lactation room. It's right down the hall, and like I said, it's a really nicely set up room, and it has everything I need. So knowing that was there kind of made it easier for me to come back, I guess, because I wasn't so like, oh my god, where am I gonna go? Oh, bless you. The first time around when I had my oldest son, we didn't have a nice room set up, so it was really hard to go and pump for him. Sometimes I would be in one room, sometimes they were using that room for other stuff, so they would send me off to some random room. There were times where I even had to go in like just empty medical exam rooms because they didn't know where to put me. And then I didn't really have a place to store my milk that I had pumped. I would have to bring like a little freezy bag thing with me, and then bring it right to my mom's on lunchtime, just so I had somewhere to put it, because I didn't want to leave it in like the regular fridge with everyone's leftover food and stuff. It was really awkward, and back then I felt super pressured to, get in the room and get out, because I never knew if someone needed it. I never knew if someone was going to walk in on me. It was really uncomfortable. So this time around, it was like completely different. Like, they have that dedicated room, and I don't have to worry about people walking in, and I don't feel pressured to be in and out as quick as possible. So I'm really thankful that we have that to use, and I'm really thankful that people worked really hard to get that room there. I feel like having a nice spot like that is so beneficial to moms, and especially new moms. If, you know, it was really hard that first time around, and some moms might have just given up just because it was awkward and weird, and you had to go and ask random people if they knew where you were going. And I'm really thankful that I stuck with it then. So this time around I was like, I got this. And it's been going really well. I hope it continues to go well, and yeah, I feel really supported by the people at my work. I've been able to bring my baby with me to work a few times when I had to, which was nice when he was little, but now he is too big and too all over the place. He crawls and gets into everything now, so he's not coming to work with me. But my work, my bosses never had an issue with him coming with me the few times that he did, and that was really nice. I also think that's really important to have bosses and workplaces that support you when you're a new mom. It makes things way easier, especially in a time that is already kind of chaotic and brand new, and I'm really thankful for them.
Excellent, thank you. So Jamie, what I think we can do now, if I'm not sure if you have more to present, but this might be a good opportunity for everybody to show their camera, to turn on their cameras and their microphones. And again, we have about 5 minutes if people have questions or comments that they want to express.
Sure, that sounds great. And Linda, Sophie, I think, is still going to send you her testimonial, so maybe you could share that with the group even after the training.
Yeah, and
I'm sure she'll have some nice things to say.
Good, and I have the ability to embed a video into this recorded session, so I can definitely do that. And then I'll actually put the images that Sam had sent for this audio. So the recorded session that everybody will get will look nicer. It includes Sophie's testimony. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to mute myself so people can ask questions or make comments.
I guess I'll start by saying, if I have the time, I'm very, very proud of our Fond du Lac team in hearing all the wonderful things you're doing for the community. So great job, everyone. And hearing Tammy's story, I know Tammy personally. I work with her as a public health nurse and home visitor. She's our longest running doula. And I don't know, I'm very proud that we've been able to, as a team, and with you guys pushing all the legwork through that everyone's done, getting policy changes and implementing those things at all the Fond du Lac institutions. I'm very proud. I'll leave it at that. I'm going to end because I'm for some reason getting emotional about it. It's a tough fight, and I'm glad to see that teams and people are in it together to make those changes. So thank you.
And I think I would just add, I mean, if anyone has questions, please speak up. One of the things was the example of working in tribal communities. So if you are if you're working with a tribal community and helping get things going, if there's grant money available, or if your program has funding available, being able to offer the training sessions, I think, were really helpful in getting that going. And then I would say, I don't know if all communities have tribal ship coordinators or not, but that's a great place to start. And also to work with the executive directors or someone in there, probably start with Health and Human Services, and even reach out to tribal planning divisions, because planning divisions help do a lot of policy and program work too. So if you are, trying to reach out to tribal communities, I would kind of give a suggestion of those things first.
This is Sam, and I have just one little thing to add, because I know we did utilize the Public Health Law Center. Was his name Ben? And maybe if you guys, Pam, maybe you remember, I believe his name was Benjamin. But they were super helpful. They had some tribal policy examples that we kind of utilized in drafting our policy. And then just reiterating what Jamie said, it was super helpful to have Pam do that training, because then everyone did feel like they had buy-in. And a lot of it was just lack of education. Like Jamie had said, like they felt much better about it once they kind of knew why it was important, not only from like a health standpoint, but even like, insurance saving standpoint. Like Pam presented lots of different pieces of information, which I think helped. So thanks, Pam.
Yes, and it was Ben. It was a lot of fun to do those trainings, and I think the thing I learned most about it was to make sure to make it an open space, ask lots of questions about what will work in their particular setting. It doesn't help to come in and tell them how to do it. It's better if you let them brainstorm. And it was fun to hear these guys come up with all these ideas for rooms and spaces, and it was just exciting.
So this is Linda. I just want to give a little shout out to the infants at work component of your policy and how critical that is. Where I used to work in Colorado, I helped get an infants at work policy for our county. And when we looked at when we surveyed the employees of the employees who use the infants at work policy and the lactation spaces, over 80% met or exceeded their breastfeeding goals, which is very different from the usual rate of reaching breastfeeding goals. Very, very different. So it really makes a difference. And we've actually seen a difference in breastfeeding rates through WIC in communities where there is this kind of concerted effort to build out the environment that's supportive of families.
And, I would just add that was something that we kind of put in, actually expecting that once it went to legal in our human resources department, that they would probably take it out. But we asked about it in those trainings, and the response that was given was just like, yeah, that's probably fine. And we're just like, oh, great. So it was, a really good response. And I think, I know that some people were taking advantage of it, so.
So I just want to say thank you so much to Jamie and Sam and Laura and anybody else and me particularly, who have been able to share the story of the lactation policy at Fond du Lac, and just what a great model for the rest of us in Minnesota and for other communities. So thank you so much. This is, I just want to say a shout out for the Public Health Law Center, and actually a staff attorney will be speaking next, but Natasha mentioned this is a great example of innovative policy change. So perfect segue to move towards our next presenter. Is going to be from the Public Health Law Center here in Minnesota. And again, I want to invite people. We're going to move into another presentation. So if you could turn off your cameras and mute your microphones again, that'll help with the recording of the presentation. So Natasha Frost, I've another Minnesotan, a local Minnesotan, and I've known her, I think, for a couple of years now. And this is specific to childcare. So she's a staff attorney at the Public Health Center in St. Paul, and part of the team that's dedicated to understanding and improving policy and systems around the intersection of lactation and early care and education and childcare. So you can read more about her on this screen, but please join me in welcoming Natasha. And so Natasha, you just need to share your screen, and I think you can do that over mine.
Yep. All right. All right, so hello everyone. Yes, I love the kind of the flow of this, and can appreciate the excellent, I work with great people at the Public Health Law Center. We're located in St. Paul, Minnesota at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, and Melanie has currently that position of working on innovative policies like the example just shared. And I think one thing that was a key takeaway for me is that that is such a fantastic example that can be applied across the board at an organization like a childcare center, all the way through large governments like a tribal government or a state government. And I just appreciate that as, an innovative practice to kind of inspire us all to work towards such innovative policies. So I'm here today to talk about human milk in the childcare setting. We've had some great, like I said, great presentations. And so I'm gonna build off of that specific to the childcare setting. This is actually built off of a presentation that we're doing for health consultants. And it's been a real collaborative effort. We've worked with several state agencies, several advocates, and individuals. And there's two folks, colleagues of mine from the Public Health Law Center who did a lot of background work. And so I want to acknowledge them. And this was funded as part of that statewide health improvement partnership. And I'll just say that the statewide health improvement partnership really funds the support in a lot of areas related to breastfeeding. We have several different funding streams, but the reason Public Health Law Center in part can be involved in kind of the childcare at work in breastfeeding has been because of SHIP. And so we are really happy to be a partner in that effort. So one thing that is important to ground us in, and we've been talking about this throughout the entire day so far, is this idea of equity. And the equity issues in this area are really, really important to consider, thinking about voice and whether or not people have, even though they have so many legal protections, some workers may not feel comfortable asking for what they need. There might be other equity issues at play that relate to historical and current context. And so one of the things I've tried to do with this presentation is just to ground it in that idea that the laws protect you in a certain way, but just because those protections exist does not mean that everyone feels comfortable exercising those protections. And so the other piece of this is this concept of social determinants of health, which is looking at our entire cultural context. And one thing that I have been honored to discuss at length as part of our work on this presentation in particular has been how critical breastfeeding and kind of the idea of the importance of starting children outright and having human milk available in whatever form that is. It's just such an critical part of the social determinants of health in so many areas. Protecting nursing mothers and access to human milk is really critical as it relates to economic stability. I mean, we talked about some of that already with employment and income and the expense of formula. The educational environment is impacted. We're going to talk a little bit more. That's the focus of this presentation. The really seeing human milk as food and really lifting it up as that first food is really critical in reframing the context of how human milk is actually provided and in each setting that it's provided in and how it's provided to children. And then this idea that when we focus on human milk and supporting nursing mothers and breastfeeding, that really helps with that community connectivity. It helps when we have strong policies and a supportive environment, it can really combat stress and discrimination and pull in social integration, which has that is a really critical piece. And, you know, I could go more into, there's issues related to breastfeeding with housing and safety and parks and over in healthcare too, but these are the ones that really stood out to me. So we've talked about this a lot already, where we have a lot of laws that protect and impact this area. So some impact the area, and you know, Jessica Lee talked about the ones that protect the environment for the workplace, employers and students. What I'm going to focus in today is on the childcare setting. So the Department of Human Services has broad authority over that space and has really set the regulations. And I do this kind of summary because there's this web of ways of the law protecting. So like the maroon is the court cases. So that's our judicial branch, and they kind of interpret the statutes and laws. The green is our the statutes that really protect or that really set the stage, and that's the legislative branch that passes those statutes. And then you have the blue, which is our executive agencies that really end up passing rules and regulations. I mean, we have a representative today from the Department of Labor and Industry who knows that space well on implementing the rules and regulations through that executive power. And so the way that childcare is regulated, it really relies heavily on, there's a state statute, but it really defers the majority of the power of oversight and implementation onto the state agency of the Department of Human Services. So there's a lot of regulations that impact childcare. The Minnesota Department of Health has a little piece of that in that they actually regulate food establishments. And so there's a little piece where childcare centers, the kind of space is regulated through a food establishment where you have a local public health person who comes out and looks at the space as a food establishment. So those are how that's the kind of regulatory context of childcare in Minnesota. So how does this relate to early care and education more generally? I could go into a lot more detail. We actually have a webpage that we developed that has, this is the link, and the website goes through kind of who has which oversight. I will note that what I am focusing on today is the state regulatory power over the childcare space. So tribes have sovereignty over their tribe. So they create their own, and we just saw an example of that. So I am not going into each individual tribe's regulatory power and how they've exercised that power over the childcare facilities in their jurisdiction. Today, I'm really just focused on the state. And so that's that kind of the middle area. But this website does go through the various forms of government and what the regulatory structure looks like for things like food safety and licensing and a variety of other things. So I'll let you guys take a look at that after this presentation or at your leisure. But there's two things I want to highlight today because it matters when it comes to childcare. And it matters when it comes to human milk and breastfeeding. And that's the definition of age, like when is a child an infant and when is the child a toddler? And we heard today that that year marker is a marker for workplaces in a couple of the laws. Well, each law, depending on what it's looking at, has a different definition. So that's one of those things where we have to be really specific with our words and the ages, because there is that thing between infants and toddlers. And what's funny is that even the regulations of a particular, the definitions can change depending what you're talking about. So these are the two regulations that are in the definitions that are in the regulations for the childcare setting. One is just a general definition, and one is how they define age and define infant and toddler as it relates to staff ratios. So they are different depending on what you're talking about, even within the same set of regulations. We're really lucky to work with some fantastic partners who do things like this. So not only are the regulations for licensing different as it relates to defining infant and toddler, House CACFP, which is our Child and Adult Care Food Program, that's a different definition for infants and toddlers. WIC has a different definition. And actually the nice thing is CACFP and WIC are aligned, but it's just really important to keep in mind that you have to be really careful about using the term infant or toddler without really having a level of specificity. So what we did as part of this effort to try and pull together the information on the policies and laws that protect serving human milk in childcare centers is we came up with these commonly asked questions. I could throw up a bunch of legal citations, but we found it was a lot easier to just kind of have a question answer. These questions came from advocates like you, maybe even some of you on this call, on what issues were coming up. Sometimes we identified an issue and it was really easy to get the word out and fix the problem. And there are a few examples of that in this presentation. And the other, some other times, and one of them that we'll talk about is serving human milk in toddler rooms is a little harder to navigate. I'll just say I'm focusing on childcare centers today because quite honestly, that's where we're seeing the questions and the issues of interpretation. And it's likely because it's more regulated, the kids are separated out more, there's this transition from infant to toddler in a more distinct way. And what we'll talk about in a little bit, health consultants play a role in the childcare centers and they do not play that same role in family childcare homes. All right, and I will say I am trying to look at the chat box. We will have time for questions at the end. But if there is something that comes up, please just throw it in the chat box and I have it right next to me here. All right, so how many of you have reached out to either a SHIP person or somebody about how childcare centers have had to accommodate breastfeeding mothers on site? Anyone, if you can just put your comment in the chat or have had this issue come up. Okay, well, at least one. So go ahead and put it in there. And I think what we're seeing is that there's often been questions about whether or not that can happen. And the answer is that there is no legal way to require a childcare center to accommodate a breastfeeding mother on site unless it is pulled under one of those fantastic examples as an employer that was described very well in our first presentation by Jessica Lee. So the idea is that unless it's an employee, there's no legal right to breastfeed on site. However, there is several reasons that through the kind of the great advocacy and training expertise that Jamie Adams talked about, there might be able to be some room to advocate with the childcare center to allow it to happen. There's a lot of good data, why it's practical. There may be some limitations with COVID, but once we get through this, if you have those questions, again, there's some really good arguments. One of the things we heard the most is that it actually impacts reimbursements for their child and adult food care program. And that problem was actually fixed at the federal level. And so that information may not have been communicated correctly to the center. So just finding out what was the barrier, is it space? Is it, if it's space, then there's great opportunities for funding through SHIP to help support the center in creating a space. There's this market advantage from MDH to be designated as a breastfeeding friendly childcare center. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities to have that one-on-one advocacy. And I know that the Statewide Health Improvement Partnership has fantastic resources. And as I think has been mentioned, the Public Health Law Center works directly with SHIP and local public health in order to help support efforts in this area. All right. So one of so there was a question, legally, if both lactating parent and child are allowed to be on site, shouldn't that mean that they're also allowed to breastfeed? The answer is yes, if they are actually able to legally be on site for any period of time. There is a lot of situations that allow where the parents' restriction in the center, or the parents are restricted in the center, and that's due to safety concerns. The limitations on people who come into the center based on some of the other regulations related to background checks and who can come in and out is really specific as it relates to DHS. And so it's a highly controlled space because of those other requirements related to background checks and that sort of thing. And so it really depends on the level of allowing in a public space. Often when parents are allowed in the space, it's in public. And so the question was really related to, are they required to provide a space for them to actually breastfeed? So it's not the same as the legal protections for nursing mothers who are employees. But there is this, if they're allowed in the space and they're allowed in a public space, they're allowed to breastfeed there, but that doesn't mean that the accommodation for the space as it's required for employees is the same. Hopefully that answers that question. All right, so how are the policies and procedures regarding human milk consumption regulated? I mentioned this before. There's two key ways that it's regulated. The most important one, and the ones we're actually finding where there's a lot of opportunities for advocacy, are with health consultants. So there are health consultants in Minnesota. How many of you all have worked with health consultants or might be a health consultant? Go ahead and just put it in the chat. And for those of you who aren't, the health consultants are these experts that come into the childcare setting, and they do a variety of things. They have been pivotal and critical as we've navigated this public health crisis, and as a resource for childcare centers, directors and staff, in ensuring that safety is met for everyone there. They have a legal responsibility under the statute, under the regulations, that they have to review policies and procedures for human milk. I mean, that's specifically as it relates to the childcare centers. It is not family childcare homes. They look at human milk for consumption for infant diets. It's interesting because it just says infant diets, and sanitation overall for all food. They are, so that is kind of their role among other things. I mean, they look at a variety of different health procedures at the site, and there are specific requirements for review of those policies as well as seeing the space. So this is, first aid procedures, other safety procedures, and then they have this last bullet here, and that's the citation. So that's food that's either served or brought in by the provider or the food for infants. All right, so there's some key things that we're seeing with health consultants. So so all centers have to have health policies, which is great because we want policies, as Jamie Adams talked about, like having a policy is a really good thing to make sure you have something to go to enforce and to get everyone on the same page. And also Jessica Lee talked about that as well, where policies can be critical, and when they're well drafted and well done and innovative, they can really change an entire environment. The health consultants don't write the policies, they review them. And so they actually can make recommendations. They serve as a guide, but they're not mandated to do that. And that's where this whole presentation came from, because we had a lot of health consultants that were saying that you couldn't serve human milk in toddler rooms, which we'll get to in a little bit, but that is, there's no requirement for the centers to follow what the health consultants say, but the reality is that most centers actually just do what the health consultants say is the appropriate way to draft these policies. And in fact, most there's two main health consultant groups, and they each have their own set of model policies. And if any of you have worked with model policies, oftentimes it's easier just to take the model policies, change the name from sample to the name of your center, and hit save. So that is often what happens. But health consultants are fantastic advocates in helping with infant diets and making sure that the centers are preparing human milk correctly. The one thing that's really important to note is that for health consultants have to follow the other parts of the regulations, which include that parents get to direct an infant diet. So again, the health consultants have no power to say what the infant should eat, only to help and navigate overall policies that the centers have related to infant diets. The parents are in charge of deciding what their infant gets to eat. So then there's this issue of the toddler rooms, again, that we're gonna go over that specifically. And there's also something where there is, having human milk available for toddlers, and that is outside the purview of a health consultant unless it's specific to overall what nutrition and health requirement or health policies are impacted from a food safety perspective. All right, and so just a note, because health consultants have a really heavy hand in and a great way of guiding the center in how they're gonna have food policy. There's also, it's important to note that there is a, local public health is usually doing the inspections for food safety because it is considered a food establishment. And so there is a couple different folks at play in the food environment in that childcare setting. And so if there's issues that come up, it's important to figure out, okay, is it the health consultant or is it the local public health that's come in to do the inspection for food establishment? So what are the rules for handling human milk? We had, there has been, what is done to educate health consultants on lactation in childcare centers? That is a great question. The whole presentation that I'm using today is actually, we are hoping to get I think 100 slides. So I have them down to 30 and there's a lot of information, and that's a lot what Keenan and Craig did, is helping explain to health consultants the importance of lactation and human milk and the role of breastfeeding on site. And so we will likely be holding additional trainings once we get back to that work. It paused when we, last March, actually. So we're ramping it back up in the hopes that this year we really breathe life back into it, and we'll be reaching out to this group to help execute and have those trainings available for health consultants and drawing the connections so that you all can be a resource for them as well. All right. What are the rules for handling human milk? So this has come up a lot. I don't know, have any of you had specific issues related to handling, like we just have so many people who think you have to wear gloves and we can't figure out where it's coming from. We actually think what happened is the health consultants it's either coming from the health consultants and as a misinterpretation of kind of worker safety. We have a lot of data or a lot of information related to this. I had to cut the slides. But here's the takeaway. Nope, don't need to wear gloves to handle breast milk, period. There are, it's like human food of all forms. So if you don't touch the milk, just like you wouldn't have to wear gloves to hold onto a container with applesauce in it. It's the same thing. Just like you don't actually have to use a glove to hold a glass of milk. It's the same thing. So where we're seeing it, a couple of the centers that I talked to, they wear gloves for everything, especially with COVID. That's only increased. And so if you wear gloves for everything, then it's likely you're going to be wearing gloves when you're handling human milk. So but you don't have to treat it any differently. And it is not considered a biohazard when it spills. And so that is another question that we get a lot. And there's a lot of data to back that up in the law, also in just best practice. Let's see, there's a lot of things. We'll get back to it when we get to the questions, so I can just finish up the slides here. The key is training. And so a lot of people don't understand. I mean, if they don't have a lot of training, and again, this is another thing that we talked about several times throughout today with other presentations. Sometimes you can handle these misconceptions with training for the staff and with appropriate policies and procedures. So it's important to also flip on that, where we actually want center staff who have an exposed wound, to actually be wearing gloves. And so it's like, it's important to contextualize, why are they wearing the gloves? If it's to protect the staff from the milk, that's not necessary from a health perspective or from a legal perspective. But if they're just kind of have a policy across the board, or if they're trying to protect the milk from the person's hands, then that's something to consider. There have been situations where related to this handling where the staff actually doesn't feel comfortable serving the milk because it's a different color or because of a particular odor. And it's really important to have training related to this. Health consultants are a huge advocate in that because they're doing training for the staff on site and they can have policies. And it's just across the board. If a parent sends breast milk and says that, or human milk and says that's what gets served, that's what gets served. And so we had recommended as part of this training that there's a plan in place in case there's any questions about the human milk and serving it. And it's just really important. One of the things that we have found is this is a really critical area when it comes to bias and discrimination, where there are certain groups, including Black and Indigenous and other people of color, where there's a particular bias related to a parent and that's associated and then translated into discrimination as it relates to serving breast milk. And so it's really critical that this information is communicated appropriately and contextualized for the staff members who are serving infants. And that is where good policy and training are critical. All right, and then this is the big one. Anyone on the call today so this is literally the reason we were working on this. We got so many calls from you all who are like, wait a minute, we're being denied access to human milk in the toddler room. Like they're saying they won't serve it, and nursing mothers had to stop serving or, nursing or stop serving their children, sending human milk to the childcare center because of this. And the critical issue is that yes, childcare centers, there's no legal restrictions. They absolutely can serve breast milk in toddler rooms. Health consultants we're trying to get the health consultants on as allies to get this to happen. There are ways to do it that can minimize the concerns that center staff have. Where this is coming from is the center staff is actually worried that if somebody else grabs a sippy cup with human milk in it, and it's not it's not the child's sippy cup, and somebody else another child drinks it, they're worried about honestly, they're worried about a DCF or a DHS report, which then can translate into a lot of problems, legal problems. And so that's where this is coming from. And we're actually hearing a lot of health consultants saying, just don't do it. Just don't serve toddler milk or don't serve human milk in toddler rooms because it's just easier. And so this training was developed in order to bring health consultants on board to actually support human milk being in toddler rooms. We actually have DHS as part of our group. And we asked them, like, what do you want those referrals about human milk going to the wrong child? And the answer is that the statute's really clear. If the center believes that the human milk resulted in harm, really critical, as defined by the statute, then the center should report the harm. So if the center believes that there was harm caused to the child, then that's when the report has to be issued. Unless that happens, and there's a lot of science behind that, you don't need to make that report. And so this is an area that's developing, and we're working with the health consultants as well as centers who are supportive of this and other advocates to figure out how can we create a really regulated space so that the space really falls into line where these concerns are minimized. And there's already really strong like allergen policies on the books where it's like if another child has an allergy, there's a way to like make sure that that child doesn't get access to foods that could cause an allergic reaction. And so there's a lot of, even though we don't want to separate out children who have human milk, there's ways to actually create a space and an environment where, and it's a highly regulated environment because it's their children eating. We believe that there are ways through advocacy and training that can create a space where their human milk can be allowed in toddler rooms. Plus, there's a ton of centers that are already doing it. So it's absolutely possible. And through storytelling and training, we believe it could happen. All right, I want to make sure we have time for questions and we're running out of time. So let's see, can the center require that a partially fed bottle of human milk has to be dumped and not reused? The answer is no, because the parent gets to direct what is done with that milk. So that parent plan is what the center has to follow for how the milk is used. They don't have, there's no way for the parent to require them to serve it later. They can have their own internal policies, but the parent can require that it goes back home, and that parent then has the responsibility of navigating what to do with that milk. Can you get you can get HIV from breastfeeding? I think that's why people like it, handle it like other bodily fluid. Actually, that's based on the science that we have, that is actually not the current data that we have related to the human milk transmission of HIV. So, so I'm not an expert in that area, and we have a lot of information. And so if you are interested in more information, I can throw my email in the chat and I can send you the information that we have in the larger session, or in the larger PowerPoint presentation, because we actually do go into that. There are other issues related to contamination that is much more concerning when it comes to that. And, you know, even COVID would be a little like, that would be something to navigate, but HIV has not been proven to be one that is actually the issue as it relates to, and we actually had a really long conversation about this, which is really funny, because there is this idea that there's no proven case, but there's no proven case that it couldn't happen. There's no way for the data to prove that it couldn't happen, but over the last 25 years, like a child who's had incidental access to breast milk with the HIV in it, that there has been no transmission through that accidental exposure. So anyway, I'm not expert in that, I'm a lawyer, but we did have a lot of conversations related to that. All right. So those are the CDC recommendations if in fact you have a mistakenly fed and there's another woman's expressed breast milk. A lot of this actually doesn't result in a referral over to DHS, and it's more just about communication and upfront communication with parents prior to, like if they're in the same toddler room, like we've talked about having some conversations with all the parents in the toddler room, having conversations about how they would actually like any sort of any of those instances, like if that happens, like how they would like it handled, and creating that that really community vibe of that space to support a nursing mother. And so that's kind of how we've talked about it as it relates to the center side of things. All right, so I think I'm gonna leave it open for questions, but I will say, you know, many of you have contacted the Public Health Law Center directly, and that's absolutely possible. I'll leave that on the list as well. But I do want to lift up the Statewide Health Improvement Partnership as a resource. It's really a great resource to contact local public health who's doing SHIP work. I have the site here. The Public Health Law Center has a grant through SHIP to help support SHIP grantees and the folks they're working with, which includes a lot of you advocates. So that's how we are able to help support the network across the state. And I appreciate all of our partnerships with other organizations and efforts, as well as state agencies, and look forward to kind of furthering those over the coming year. Thank you for your time, and I will put my contact information up as we look to questions. So if you wanna, actually, I'll stop share, because you're gonna send out the link to all these slides, and then do you want me to
Tasha, yeah,
have the
thank you
conversation?
so much. This is perfect. We definitely are going to, probably by tomorrow, we're going to send the recording of this workshop, and we'll send PDFs of all these slides. And so LaSharon and Sienna, I hear the request for the factual information or the current data on HIV transmission breast milk, you know, if it can be or cannot. So I will find that link or that document with the most current data, and I'll include it in that mailing tomorrow to everybody, so everybody has access to that. So thank you very much for requesting that most current data. And actually, we do have the director of the Minnesota Milk Bank on here too. So she probably very likely one of those people that has the most current data on that too. I think we have a couple minutes for questions. If people want to unmute themselves or show their camera just for a moment, just to ask a question or two, or if you see something in the chat, that's a question you want to respond to, Natasha.
I'm looking to see if I got everyone.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we might want to send out is this idea of the distinction between breast milk as a body fluid versus a food.
Right.
And there has been a lot of work in that area, and even Caring for Our Children has a clear distinction between the two and has best practices listed out. So there's a lot of resources we were able to pull together. And Linda, I know those initial slides that I sent over has some of that information. I don't know if you have any of that as well.
Sure, I can do that too.
And that was all the questions that I see here.
Okay. Well, I want to say thank you so much, not just to you, Natasha, but to your team and to the Public Health Law Center at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, and just what a great partner you are for all of us in Minnesota, and really highlighting SHIP and what a great partnership is. Holly Globitz is the person at the State Health Department that really does a lot of that designation and policy work around breastfeeding friendly environments, and she couldn't be with us today, but just a big thank you to all of you, and we are staying in touch because that's what you do when you want to have strong partnerships. So I want to move into our next breakout session, everybody. This is another just less than 20 minutes. It's another opportunity to talk with your colleagues and friends and compatriots. And this time we're divided by sector. So I want to say welcome back again. I think most people are back. If you could put your summary of your conversation in the chat section. I'm gonna see if, and we're gonna just wrap up in a couple minutes, but Carrie, would you be able to look in the chat section and see if there are a couple summaries that we can discuss, we can mention?
Sure, I can share from the breastfeeding friendly employer distinction helped give structure and build sustainable plan, created a lactation steering group comprised of HR reps from different organizations. Employers appreciate having a model to draw from. Having a preset annual lactation budget is a quick and easy to draw from when needs arise. Hospital grade pumps on site, framing lactation as a medical need, monthly steering committee meetings, those were some opportunities. Some challenges: the AAP language of up to 6 months confuses employers, may need to offer guidance around pumping beyond 6 months. Judgment for people pumping beyond 6 months. Difficult to find policies in huge file systems of large medical complexes, and finding more culturally specific resources for most marginalized employees. Another group talked about getting space for lactation rooms in schools. They have to advocate and fight for space. They also want to have this space be available to students and other parents as well, so that we do not create an us versus them situation. We have to include breastfeeding in the curriculum to normalize breastfeeding. There's a group made up of public health, so SHIP, WIC, and nurses. We had a discussion about creating letters or templates that could be used describing the right of a parent and helping the parent communicate to their employer or daycare provider what their needs are. For example, saving breast milk, more time off for maternity leave. We also noted that employees are hesitant to set up their rights because they're worried about losing employment. It's important to have advocates that can help a parent in communicating their needs. A toolkit of templates that is easily available.
Thank you. So excellent. I'm going to actually wrap this up. We're at time. We've covered quite a bit of ground today. And so all that's left is to say thank you to everyone. Say thank you to the presenters, to those who shared their stories and who will be sharing your story, because you'll receive their story when you get the recording, because we'll put Sophie's story from Fond du Lac in there. Thank you to our planners. We put this together over a very tumultuous couple of months and during a crazy time of pandemic. And I just want to say, I am so grateful for everybody, for your willingness to meet regularly and your willingness to tackle something that's pretty challenging. So thank you so much. Again, so probably tomorrow you will receive the recording, the slides, and the link for the evaluation. And it's through the evaluation that you will receive your certificate for eSERPs. And I just want to say one other thing to stay tuned. I am from Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition. We'll be convening a workplace and childcare roundtable on Tuesday, February 23rd. I don't have the time finalized yet, but we're going to have a roundtable for folks in Minnesota who are the key players in breastfeeding friendly and chest feeding friendly work sites and childcare, and just come together in a virtual table. And we will just share what each of us does, our little slice of the pie, and how we can better connect and better work with each other to make this a really nice, seamless system. Again, the theme today was really partnerships, wasn't it? So how can we have that partnership among the different organizations and people that are working in this to make sure that no family really ever falls through the crack, that those environments are solid and fully supportive of breastfeeding families. So I want to say thank you and have a really wonderful weekend.